As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Now we want to look more systematically at Plato's ethics, having laid the overall foundations. But first I want to backtrack in time for a moment and say a few words about Socrates' views on ethics. Now Socrates, as I said, was Plato's teacher. And he developed certain ethical views of his own, rather generalized but still very important, and they were subsequently taken up and developed by Plato, and in a different way also by Aristotle. Now I will not give you a full presentation of Socrates' views this evening. I'll concentrate for the most part only on those which are essentially valid, mentioning an occasional error but not focusing on it. Socrates was a champion, as I mentioned last week, of an absolute, objective, universal code of ethical principles. He was an arch opponent of the sophists. He believed that ethics was a science, not a matter of feelings and impulses. Now, he never worked out a full system of ethics, but he had leads to it. Perhaps his most important lead was the parallel he was fond of drawing between the soul and the body. Now consider for a moment the body. It obviously has a definite nature, and there are therefore definite conditions that have to be fulfilled to keep it healthy. And there are definite sciences whose function is to determine those conditions. There is in the Greek world gymnastics, the method of taking care of and exercising the body to keep it healthy, and medicine, the method of curing its various ailments. Now, there are certain options. You can do sit-ups or push-ups, for instance, or eat one kind of food with so-and-so many vitamins, or another kind which has the same number. There are options, but the principles of bodily care are mandatory and not optional. If you disobey them, you have a diseased, sick body. And of course, notice certain things may give you temporary pleasure, for instance, dope or poison. But there is nevertheless an objective basis for declaring that these things are wrong because they subvert the life of the individual. They destroy his body. The result is that after a few flickers of pleasure, we have the ravaged dope addict, the alcoholic with DTs, etc. The general rule is definite physical conditions universally have to be met to achieve physical health and therefore true bodily welfare. And this requires you to tend your body scientifically, to exercise reason and self-control as against acting on any whim or urge you get. Now for Socrates, and he was the first really to emphasize this, the same is true of the soul. Now by the soul we mean here, in the context of Socrates, the psychological or spiritual element in man. The soul has a definite nature, and there are definite conditions required for it to be healthy. Universal conditions deriving from the nature of the soul. In modern terms, we don't talk about an unhealthy soul, but we recognize the phenomenon he was referring to. We talk about a tortured neurotic, a psychotic, a man who is anxious, guilty, depressed, self-doubtful, torn by conflicts, etc. Well, that's what Socrates would call a sick soul. And you must live a certain way if you are to have a healthy soul, as proved by the fact that there are such things as sick souls. You have to live virtuously. Now you must understand what the Greeks mean by virtue. They use it simply to mean excellent performance of function, whatever the function happens to be. If the function of a knife is to cut, then a sharp knife is a virtuous knife. It's a knife which has the virtue or power of being able to perform its function. A virtuous man, therefore, is a man who performs his function correctly and looks after his soul accordingly. You mustn't associate virtue as used by any of the Greeks with the meaning it came to have under Christianity. Virtue, the actual word that we use, is the same root as virility, and vir is of course Latin for man. Now it is, as someone once pointed out, it's a fascinating commentary on the development of civilization that the word virtue passed from meaning a manliness in a man to chastity in a woman. That is the legacy of Christianity. In any event, ethics for Socrates is the science of achieving health in the soul. It is on the level of the soul what gymnastics and medicine is on the level of the body. And therefore there are objective absolute principles of ethics, just as there are in the case of the body. If you follow them, you will achieve happiness. But Socrates insists, and Plato and Aristotle agree with him, that there are therefore definite conditions imposed by human nature for the achievement of happiness. It is not, they all insist, a matter of acting on any desire you happen to have. Happiness has objective universal conditions. Now, of course, today it's bromide that people can achieve happiness any way they choose, that it's arbitrary, subjective, etc. But of course, the Greeks are right, not the sophist Greeks, but the main line from Socrates on, are right in this viewpoint. It is not true that the way to achieve happiness is to have any arbitrary desire and then simply satisfy it. The proof of that is endless. Without the right psychological conditions, you can have a passion for money and acquire it and end up a miserable Park Avenue neurotic. Or a passion for fame and acquire it and end up a movie star on a Beverly Hills couch in psychotherapy forever. Or a passion for love and acquire it and end up one of those self-doubting neurotics who feels that he's a fraud and worthless and the love simply makes him feel worse. Socrates is right. Misery is the consequence of a diseased or unvirtuous or unjust soul. So he, along with the Greeks in general, demand proof when you say about a man he's happy. They take that as an achievement because it means he is a completely moral man. They do not sling the term happiness the way the moderns do. And therefore, if somebody tells 3 jokes at a party and gets roaring drunk, they do not say he is happy. They say he is having a temporary titillation. And they clearly distinguish, there's 2 different Greek words, one meaning pleasure, one meaning happiness. Pleasure is hedone, from which we get hedonism. And happiness is eudaimonia, which is the much broader term encompassing the whole condition of the soul. Now it follows from Socrates' view that no man can really be harmed by anybody else. And he says this because, in the basic sense, the crucial determinant of his soul and of his state is up to him, how he conducts himself. Nobody can make you unhappy in this fundamental sense. Now here we must distinguish, as he did, between what we can call inner and outer happiness. The external conditions, how people treat you, and your inner state. Now Socrates, for instance, as Plato depicts him, as a man of inner tranquility, peace of mind, serenity. He has a healthy soul. Now if true, other people can defame him, rob him, even kill him. But in this deep sense, they cannot get to him. They can't destroy his inner serenity. And conversely, they cannot give you happiness in any basic sense. They can give you money, fame, love, etc., but not the inner harmony or health which makes them enjoyable. Now I should say, ideally, for the Greeks, it's nice to have both the inner and the outer. But the crucial thing is the inner, because that's what determines your whole direction. The crucial thing is to have a healthy soul. Not just life, but the good life. Never to commit injustice no matter what. Never to commit evil, because evil is like poison, in a literal sense. It brings only suffering and self-destruction in its wake. That's the substance of the Socratic contribution to ethics.
The Pentagon announced on Sunday night that it launched another round of airstrikes in eastern Syria, targeting facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran-affiliated groups, and that is referring to the Shia militias who operate in Iraq and Syria. So the strikes mark the third known round of U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria since U.S. troops in the region have come under a spate of attacks due to President Biden's support for Israel's assault on Gaza. So the Pentagon said on Saturday that U.S. bases have been targeted 48 times since October 17th, leaving 56 American troops injured. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that the airstrikes launched on Sunday specifically targeted a training facility and a safe house near the cities of Abu Kamal and Mayadin, which are both located in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province. So the last round of U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria took place on November 8th, and before that was on October 27th. And if you remember, the U.S. said that these attacks were designed to deter, that these airstrikes were designed to deter further rocket and drone attacks on U.S. bases. Well, that clearly hasn't worked, and U.S. officials have acknowledged that the deterrence strategy has failed. And I just saw some unconfirmed reports on Twitter of more attacks on U.S. bases in Syria, right after these airstrikes. So things are really escalating here, and I think it's unfortunately only a matter of time before American troops start sustaining some serious casualties, or an American troop could be killed. And an umbrella group known as the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for most of these attacks, and we've had certain militia leaders come out and put out statements basically saying that these attacks are not going to stop until the war in Gaza stops, until there's a ceasefire. So it's all about that. It's all about U.S. supporting Israel, and the U.S. should not be in Syria and Iraq in the first place. The smart thing to do would be to just bring the troops home instead of escalate the situation, which is what the U.S. is doing here, while claiming they don't want escalation, but it's very clear that these airstrikes are just going to keep provoking more attacks. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Sunday that Israel should follow the rules of war in Gaza, but would not say if he believed the Israeli military is doing so. So this was really something. And Sullivan made these comments on CNN's State of the Union when he was asked if Israel needed to do more to limit civilian casualties. So Sullivan said that Israel has a responsibility, quote, to operate according to the rules of war, and we have continued to make that point both publicly and privately, and we will continue to do so as we go forward, end quote. So he's asked about the civilian casualties, says Israel must follow the rules of war, but then he's asked if they are following the rules of war and says he's not going to judge Israel. His response to the question was, quote, I'm not going to sit here and play judge or jury on that question, end quote. So I think it's just a really good kind of encapsulation of the attitude of the Biden administration, of the U.S. when it comes to what's going on in Gaza. We're seeing this mass slaughter of civilians and children, and they're saying, hey, that's not good, but they're not really doing anything to stop it. They're supporting it 100%. And even when asked questions like this, do you think they're following the rules of war? And what are the rules of war? What rules is the U.S. going by? The U.S. doesn't apply international law if it doesn't suit its interests. So, but just that reply, again, just a good encapsulation, I think, of the attitude. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said several times in recent days that the Israeli Defense Forces is the only force that can control Gaza after the war, signaling plans for a long-term military occupation. So he made some comments on Friday at a meeting with Israeli mayors. He said, quote, IDF forces will remain in control of the Strip we will not give it to international forces, end quote. If you remember, there were reports that said the U.S. and Israel was considering some sort of multinational force in Gaza. So we've seen the Biden administration officials say that they don't want Israel to reoccupy Gaza, but the U.S. has not placed any conditions on its support for Israel's campaign. So Netanyahu told NBC's Meet the Press, quote, "We need to see the following two things. Gaza has to be demilitarized and Gaza has to be de-radicalized." And I think so far we haven't seen any Palestinian force, including the Palestinian Authority, that is able to do that, end quote. So I had to mention here some, what I think is important context, and I linked to this great article that Scott Horton and Connor Freeman wrote titled "Netanyahu's Support for Hamas Has Backfired." They published it about 2 weeks ago, but they actually updated it the other day with just some more quotes. And it's really about this strategy that Netanyahu and other Israeli officials have had. They don't want a Palestinian state, within the West Bank and Gaza. So they've kind of capitalized on the split between the different Palestinian factions, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And, the big quote from Netanyahu, this is from a 2019 meeting, Likud party meeting, and it just illuminates his strategy when it comes to Hamas, keeping them separate from the PA in the West Bank. Netanyahu said, quote, "Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank," end quote. Here, President Biden is meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and that is going to happen this Wednesday in San Francisco at this APEC summit. And this comes, of course, amid very high tensions, and this report from the South China Morning Post says that contentious issues are on the table. So they're going to be discussing the need for military-to-military dialogue. Apparently the White House said it's going to be contentious talks. And, they, as I always point out, because I think it's important to point out, the U.S. kind of frames these talks that they've been having with Chinese officials as a way to manage the competition and not really a way to resolve issues. They just want to keep going the course they're going with China with this military buildup, right near China and all this new support for Taiwan. But, try to act like they're doing it responsibly.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Chris Christie, I can't even believe his commitment to war talking points. In terms of whatever paycheck he gets and whoever he really works for, the fact that he's still up there selling that the Ukraine war is noble, just, and needs to happen. Yeah. We need, it's over. And he's still there in the fourth quarter giving a hoorah speech of, no, we need to be backing and fighting this war.
You know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of, do you ever see there were these people who would swear there were weapons of mass destruction 3-4 years after Bush and Cheney had given up on
Still going for it. No one told them
they're not even doing dude, they're not even spewing this propaganda anymore. Even the guys themselves, they're like, no, we did find weapons of mass destruction because we found this one stockpile. And then if you actually look into the details of it, it's like, oh yeah, no, we found the old weapons that we had sold Saddam Hussein in 1980 that were defunct at this point. You know what I mean? It's just, and you're like, oh yeah, if they really found weapons of mass destruction, how come Bush isn't bringing this up? How come Cheney's not bringing it up? Even they've abandoned this, and yet you're still on this. And so here's the choice really between, if you look back at, say, what was the choice between John McCain and Mitt Romney and Mike Huckabee? It was, who delivers this better? Who do you think is the best guy to say the same thing that we're all going to say to every single question? That's what it always was. And so I'm grateful that Vivek was in these debates, because at least then there's someone saying some of the things that we would like. I will say that on the podcast and in these presidential debates, I just think Vivek's answers on the Israel-Palestine war is just not good enough. I think that he's taking the non-interventionist position, which I do appreciate, but it seems like when it came to the debate, he was almost trying to make an effort. And this was the one area he was doing such a great job at separating himself on everything else. But it seems like he's just not willing to do it on this. But if you actually listen to what he's saying, he is taking the non-interventionist position. But in the debate, he did his best to make sure that he also sounded like everybody else while he took it.
Or direction in defending themselves. So what I would tell Bibi is that Israel has the right and the responsibility to defend itself. I would tell him to smoke those terrorists on his southern border, and then I'll tell him as president of the United States, I'll be smoking the terrorists on our southern border.
You can kind of tell what he's doing is he's like, look, I'm technically taking the non-interventionist point. I'm saying you smoke those terrorists, I'll smoke these terrorists, but he's also trying his best to sound like everybody else. I would just say to Vivek, this would be my advice. When people were speculating whether I gave him debate advice or not, I did not. But this would be my advice to him that I'll make quite publicly. I'll say, look, when you're this far out of the national security apparatus consensus, when you're already calling other people out for making money from the military industrial complex, when you're already calling out what a sham the whole war in Ukraine was, let me break this to you. You're not going to win back any of that support. Those people who need you to toe the line of the military industrial complex are not going to support you anyway. So you might as well just tell the truth. Okay? You might as well, at a certain point, the principle in marketing, which is called product differentiation, is more valuable to you than this, like, I don't want to be opposed by, I don't know, by the Israeli lobby or something like that. Guess what? They're not going to support you. You're not going to be their guy. So it doesn't matter. And you might as well just separate yourself from this insanity. Because, look, I mean, Jesus Christ, like, you just think about what Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis there, and then, of course, Tim Scott and Chris Christie, by the way, they both echoed the exact same statements. Take them out. Whatever needs to be done, we will give you whatever you need whenever you need it. So we are all in on what? What exactly? No, they're not clear about that. What actually needs to be done? So in the last couple of weeks, how many people have died? Reports say 10,000, maybe more than that. Who knows? But how many of them? How many of them do you need to kill? We're all in. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, whatever you want to do, Israel. That's our position. That's what all of the Republican establishment types are saying. And I'm sorry, it is sickening. It's sickening. You're talking about actions that have killed, as horrific as what happened on October 7th was. You're talking about actions that have already eclipsed that in terms of innocent people dying. And you're saying, clearly you're saying that's not enough. We need more, right? So how much more? And it's amazing how, like, when the war fever first breaks out, when people are like talking like this, none of them need to be specific at all. None of them need to say, like, well, like, you know, how many innocent people need to die before you would question this? How much money do they get before we would question this? What? Just whatever. Go do it all. And I think it's a big mistake, both morally and strategically, for Vivek to just say, yeah, my advice to you would be to go smoke those terrorists. By the way, none of us would have a problem. None of us would have a problem if that's all Israel was doing, was smoking terrorists. That'd be fine. I'm a little bit concerned about the smoking the children, you know, like that to me is a bit of a moral problem.
Yeah, his position is essentially, listen, I'll let you guys go bomb those buildings, just not with our money.
Yeah.
Where I think what you might be missing is perhaps this helps him in his auditioning for the VP role, and that opposing all the other stuff is more in line with Donald Trump's policy, whereas to actually criticize and shed light on the grim reality of what Israel's doing right now might prohibit him from, like, being chosen for a VP or cabinet position.
Yeah, I guess maybe I just don't understand, why does Vivek even want the VP position? I
think that sets him up because Trump is only a one-term president. And
yeah,
so
I guess
VP,
you're right.
That makes him front runner in the next election. It's very.
I
mean, if he really wants to be president, that's firstly, he might feel that he can actually influence policy. Take it or leave it. I think that's more of a. I think that's just more of a VP puts you as the front runner, so you can't possibly win it in this one.
Yeah. I guess you're right. I guess there's a point to that, but goddamn, yeah, I just wish you would, like, just kind of tell the truth on this.
And to be able. I mean, if I was in charge and I brought the empire home, then what would that look like now that China is by far the dominant power in the region?
There would continue to be little skirmishes over the contested claims in the South and East China Seas. Those are really more about dominating those maritime routes for the purposes of exploiting the natural resources that are there. It isn't that whoever gets them won't want to sell them and use them and create more economic gains for all of us. It's not as though if China, had it, that they wouldn't want to sell it or engage in economic transactions. The same thing goes for Taiwan. China wants to continue to trade with Taiwan. They're not going to eat the semiconductors. They'll want to sell them to the rest of the world. China will just continue to do economic activities with its neighbors. Its population will continue to get older. Its economy will continue to slow down. It's hard to say much of what would happen after that. It's not going to conquer India or any of its neighbors. While it does have the military capabilities, according to, legitimate experts, which like you've had Lyle Goldstein on, who say, yeah, if China was really, really determined, they could definitely take over Taiwan, but it would be at a huge cost. And it would be a huge risk for Xi politically as well. Lost wars have a tendency to destabilize, a ruler's grip on power. Not only popularly in the street, but also within the corridors of power where, an internal coup could very easily be realized. And of course, there are significant risks to, an amphibious assault of that nature. Yep. So, no, none of this affects the United States at all. And in fact, even when China was far, far weaker than it is now, back in the 1950s, Murray Rothbard wrote a series of articles castigating the idea that the United States needed to defend Taiwan even way back then, and called out the whole idea of like island hopping and conquering its neighbors. It's always been a red herring that's meant to justify, Washington's preferred policies of attempted global hegemony.
Yeah. Really, I'd like to really understand the degree of the decoupling of America's economy from China since, say, Trump, maybe even before that, if you want to start before that. But I know Trump really put these tariffs up and really wanted to try to separate our economy more and more, which is so dangerous.
He wanted to, but it mostly failed. It mostly failed. And there are very obvious reasons for it. And you can just look at the total volume of trade. The Economist last year ran, just the most predictable article that like, oh my gosh, it looks like even the sanctioned products aren't, getting blocked, because what distributors do is they just break them up into smaller loads. And basically there's a certain tonnage under which the customs inspectors don't even look to see what it is. And so the volume of trade now is as great as it's ever been. It may in fact have surpassed it now that COVID has come and gone. So no, decoupling has not been very successful. Key U.S. allies are even getting like waivers, like little permission slips from Washington to like basically just keep doing business as usual. And then let's see, I was just trying to think the farmers. Oh, yeah. And I mean, we wound up paying for that trade war because we wound up having to subsidize our own farmers. Our own farmers are the ones who got hurt the most by that, because the Chinese, of course, enacted their own counter tariffs on American agricultural products, because, of course, China's very, very dependent on imports. And that's maybe something, too, that to emphasize, like, China is far more globalization dependent than the United States. China doesn't want anything to tip over the board. It does want to have its way in its immediate environs, similar to the United States or any number of powers that you could speak to. Even if you look at the European Union, underneath the veil of niceties is Franco-German domination of the continent. They rule the roost. They make the decisions. And everyone else, gains some benefits, takes some losses. I really don't want to dive into that issue, but so it's no different, really. And I do just caution people, like, this stuff does matter. Even things like those little land disputes in the South and East China Sea. I want to emphasize, those could spark the war that we all don't want. Well, I shouldn't say not all of us, maybe. Some people do. Robert Kagan believes now is the time to do it. But just to give you an example, when Trump was in charge, he wanted to give the Philippines clarification on its mutual defense treaty with the United States and said, hey, we'll back you, even in these disputes with China over like the Scarborough and Second Thomas Shoals. Now, thankfully, Duterte said no thanks. But the new ruler of the Philippines is Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And I just wrote an article about this at the Institute. He and Biden have agreed that actually any violation of Philippine sovereignty, even over these little spits of sand that no American could point to on a map, and which aren't important at all. Joe Biden just last week or the week before threatened to war with China over these spits of sand. So it's incredible. Americans are really laser focused on Taiwan, those Americans who know anything about it and who are paying attention. But, there's active little incidents all the time over there. It's very jam-packed. It's very dangerous. And it's really up to the American people to rein in their government, because these policies just perpetuate themselves, as you've documented on this show before. So it's really up to the American public to get educated. That's why I wrote this book. That's why I kept it so short. I understand people are busy and they don't want to read. This book is very, very short. It's like 84 pages, start to finish. You pick up this book, you read it, you give it to your dad, your uncle, your mom, whoever is crazy or scared about China. Look, I'm not going to kid you. China, is nothing to mess with, and it's certainly important enough to our own well-being and our own economic health and the economic health of the world that we should not crave confrontation with China, especially not over something like, for example, certainly not the Scarborough Shoals or something like that, but even Taiwan. Like the whole agreement, this was all laid to bed 40 years ago, and now Washington has decided that it wants to go back on the deal. The strategic reasons for opening to Beijing in the first place no longer exist, and almost immediately the United States, kind of regretted that once the Soviet Union was gone, and there was no Soviet Union to balance against. China's utility changed, and the only reason the policies remained geared toward engagement, which there was always a subtle undercurrent of more hawkish people, like you talked about, those generals who wrote those couple of books back in the 90s. There was always a current who said, "Nah, we should fight the Chinese." The overwhelming view, though, was, look, we'll make them rich. by helping them develop their own markets, integrating into the world, getting more trade, getting more industrialization. This will create a middle class who will demand political rights, who will transform China from within. And democracies don't fight one another, and that will make another pliant security partner for us, just like what we have in Europe. This didn't happen, though. And now that, the bill is coming due in China, as you said, they do have great rocket technology and stuff. And there's no doubt that they could absolutely obliterate any U.S. ships that came even 1,000 miles close to Taiwan in a potential conflict. So this is all very dangerous. And it is a fake China threat. China does not threaten the United States. This is not some kind of Sino-centric Red Dawn type scenario. It is completely contrived, and it's meant to sell more ships, more missiles, more planes, period.
Yeah.
John Dickinson was born. At the time of the founding, at the time of the American Revolution, he was absolutely famous. He earned the nickname the Penman of the American Revolution. Excuse me, but few people actually know him today. He's almost totally forgotten. And I'd call him probably maybe the most important founder that most people have never heard of. And in fact, when a lot of people hear about them, not always, but when they hear about him from mainstream historians, you basically get an interest, like they go deeper into this, but the overview that most people look at right at the top, the first paragraph goes kind of like this. And this is right from Thomas Jefferson's, captured Monticello website. And they write about John Dickinson. Best because Dickinson and Jefferson worked pretty closely together on a number of things. And we'll see at the end of the episode here today what Thomas Jefferson had to say about him later in life. But best known today for his refusal to vote for independence, John Dickinson was among the most influential leaders in the Continental Congress. Born into a wealthy slave-owning family, Dickinson was raised in Maryland and Delaware and studied law at the Inns of Court in London. So basically, the takeaway that I think most people would get from that introduction, rather than probably bigger picture things or a different perspective on how this story can be told, which I think you'll hear from me here today, is basically you got a rich slave-owning British lawyer that was opposed to independence. He wasn't even on board with it. And I'm going to do my best to share a different approach, covering some of his top works during the Revolution, maybe in another year. And I've been doing a number of episodes throughout the years on this show, covering Dickinson on or around his birthday. And I think next year or the year after, I'll probably do one covering his work, because we could call him also maybe the father of the Articles of Confederation. He was one of the lead drafters of the Articles of Confederation, and he was a supporter of the Constitution as well some years later. So his takes on that might be interesting as well. But let's start out with some of the things that he did. And of course, he was one of the biggest leaders amongst the Patriots against the Stamp Act. And of course, the Stamp Act was awful, 1765, and he really promoted a peaceful non-compliance approach to dealing with bad acts by a far-off government, by any government, really. This is how you deal with it. Because if you submit to them and you comply and then you hope you can convince them to stop doing this stuff later on, it's really not going to work too well, because as Jefferson, as Dickinson called it, you establish the precedent. Once they can enforce one thing, they will always try to use that as a baseline to expand. And he even warns, and I'll discuss this a little bit later in the show, against the smallest infraction on a constitution, because that is the most dangerous one. That's the one that's easiest for them to establish and build upon. So here's how he put it in his broadside against the Stamp Act. I'm sure this was primarily distributed around Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, but it could have gone broader than that. If you comply with the act, he said, by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. You unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wished for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. So every small step to John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, every small step against your charter, against your constitution, against your liberty, is a baseline for them to expand more. And you cannot comply with that stuff because, well, you're going to run into a lot of problems. Some persons may think this act of no consequence because the duties are so small. A fatal error. That is the very circumstance most alarming to me. To John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, the smallest attack on liberty, the smallest violation of the Constitution is the most dangerous one. And here's how he put it. For I am convinced that the authors of this law would never have obtained an act to raise so trifling a sum as it must do, had they not intended by it to establish a precedent for future use. To console ourselves with the smallness of the duties is to walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us, praising the neatness of the workmanship. And so I think that's letter 6. So for Dickinson, it's all about precedent. And he saw really, really small moves to set a new precedent as probably far more intentional and far more long-term thinking on the people, by the people in power. And I think if we start approaching things like that today, we often heard from people in the last few years in response to the bump stock ban, so-called Second Amendment supporters, all day long. We spent a lot of time opposing this because it doesn't matter if you are an enthusiast or if you're an expert and you think it's a so-called kiddie toy, because that's the kind of thing we would hear. Oh, that's just a kiddie toy. Who cares? They're not even thinking about it. It doesn't affect me. I would never own such a thing, is what we heard so many times. So who cares? We're not going to oppose that. We got the Second Amendment president, so everything's cool because he's not going after the stuff that I want or I own. But that's the problem. Once you establish that detestable precedent by going after something that people won't resist on as much, they're going to build on it. And we see that happening. I'll put it, Dickinson and Jefferson. Our attachment to no nation upon earth should supplant our attachment to liberty. So good. And they wrapped it up with this. This is in the second last paragraph, talking again why they were fighting back. This was a defensive fight in our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright. Again, the rights and the freedoms that you have are from the nature of your birth. They come from your creator. They come from natural law, natural rights. They come from God. However you want to describe it, they don't come from government. They don't come from charters. Those are declarations of pre-existing rights. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before. That's pretty hardcore for a guy who some historians want us to believe just opposed independence.
San Francisco.
It's so typical of government, just routinely. You're always fibbing and lying and propagandizing. But, Nancy Pelosi had something to say about this, about a wall. I think it's just when Trump was building a wall. She says a wall is an immorality, and she was opposed to it. And then she whispered, except when we have to protect ourselves in our gated communities.
Exactly.
So she was complaining back then, and he for opposing this, but she would never think. Now, I don't like walls. I'll tell you, I don't think that's a solution. But if you're going to compare walls to walls, the far left would think just even if you would brand expand the definition of a wall, just the protection of borders, just anybody marching in and making it an invasion. No, you can't do that. But you can build walls to protect the elite, and that's okay. And you can protect the walls to protect communist leaders. But I guess no big deal. Probably no big demonstrations. That's fine. There's I'm sure there's going to be a lot of demonstrations today over the people who are in disagreement with the president on his Middle Eastern policy. With Palestinians and Israel.
Yeah,
that's a big deal.
A big deal. In Chicago, people were desperate to leave Venezuela. They were desperate to leave an authoritarian country with a socialist economic system. Put on that next clip. Well, it didn't turn out so well. Migrant family journeys back to Venezuela. More are leaving Chicago as winter looms. The American dream doesn't exist anymore is the quote. They're going back. It's worse than Chicago. It's not worse than Chicago. Chicago is worse than Venezuela.
This is somewhat related, but Brownstone, which is an interesting magazine outlet, had a story recently. Has the U.S. lost its first world status?
Oh.
It's a very good article, and but it talks about exactly what we're looking at, and the answer is I think it is true that financially, I think there's a new rating again today. The rating
negative.
That they can't control as well. That's a much bigger financial statistic. And when you lower that, the statistics for our bonds, and it seems like they're able to just sort of forget about $33 trillion worth of debt, $1 trillion a year just on interest, and then on, and they play these games, and they're looking for the next war to start or something like that, distract the people. But this whole thing, you have people leaving Chicago, and I think it's sort of a little silly, but they said it's too cold.
Yeah.
I said, well, where's the global warming?
That's right.
Why don't they have a little global warming there? But they're leaving and they don't like it. But I don't think there's a net number leaving yet. But I think a net number is sick and tired of what's going on.
Yeah.
Because as some leave, and I guess we're paying their way out too.
Yeah,
but I think those are numbers. But it is significant again because, you know, their dream of coming to America didn't quite work out the way they thought.
Yeah.
That is definitely the case, and they're leaving. At the same time, they're passing some Venezuelans that are still coming in.
True,
so
true.
It is really a mixed bag, and I think when you look at allies throughout the world, there's such a mixture, and they change all the time. And how can certain countries gang up? It's never talk about voluntarism, bring countries together who would have gentlemen's agreement that we will trade with you if you trade with us,
Yeah.
and we will associate with you. But no, that never seems to happen. There's always somebody wants a special deal until all the deals run out, until the country goes bankrupt. And I think this again is a bankruptcy financially and morally on what we're witnessing in San Francisco as an example. But San Francisco, we pick on them, but we could pick on, just like the Brownstone article, they picked on the whole system, you know, of looking badly, you know.
Well, they left a failed socialist system in Venezuela and they came to a failed socialist system in the U.S.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something there in it. But let's look at a couple quotes from the article because it's worth looking at. And let's put on that next clip. The American dream, go back once, please. Yeah, one more. There we go. The American dream doesn't exist anymore, said Castellan as he laid on a blanket on the bare floor of the station in the afternoon before they left. There's nothing here for us. Migrants said they're realizing the city is at a breaking point. Not only is there no more space in shelters, they also acknowledge that some residents in Chicago oppose the opening of more shelters for them. Castellan said despite the dangerous trek to get there, often begging for money and sleeping on the streets to cross borders, the journey had not been worth it. You shouldn't have gone to Chicago. Go to the next one. He said the family decided to seek asylum in the U.S. because of the extreme poverty in which they were living in Venezuela under Venezuela's authoritarian regime, but the trip wasn't worth it. We just want to be home, he said. If we're going to be sleeping on the streets here, we'd rather be sleeping on the streets over there. So there you have it.
You know,
on Twitter X, 52 attacks on U.S. military forces since October 17th. And if you notice, many of those attacks are in Iraq. And that's what's very interesting about this, because it's not just Syria, it's Iraq. And they're attacking the U.S. It was a few days ago that Secretary Blinken said, I've got one word for all of you out there who are thinking of attacking our bases. Don't. And then they kept doing it, and they kept doing it. So this is something that's simmering below the surface that threatens to explode.
And it potentially big spreading of all this, and this involves Iran, because Iran's bases, people are attacking our bases. That's a major part of it. And I want to take a quote from that article you were talking about. The Biden administration had at first touted that these would deter further aggression on U.S. troops, but they have clearly not done it.
Yeah.
Hasn't done it, but that's what they say. But what do they say about people who oppose things like that? You know, if you happen to be in the Congress and you say that, they want to probably discipline you, you know, because, you're un-American, you know, you're saying this isn't going to do, this is the way we're going to prevent the problems, and they'll get frightened, they'll stop, and they won't attack our bases anymore. And isn't it amazing that they talk about our bases? We've been attacked by our bases by the people whose countries we're in.
Yeah, exactly.
the Iraqi people, I know there are a lot of factions. The people that live in Iraq and Syria and all these places, they attack us. And they've attacked us, you know. So we have to punish them, and we have to be tougher. It has nothing to do with this idea that it's just retaliation against what we're doing. How many miles? 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 miles away we have bases, and it just goes on, and they never stop and think. And people say, you know, you hear it routinely, whether it's conservative or liberal, the stations say, you know, we just can't let them get away with attacking us like this. Well, why don't we just get out of their way? We're in their country, you know. But so far, I gave them my 2 cents worth, and it probably wasn't worth 2 cents because not much has come of it.
Now there's one more crucial Socratic point, and that is that virtue requires knowledge. In the same way that medicine or architecture or any practical art requires knowledge. It is a very common device for Socrates to draw a parallel between the various practical arts and ethics, the art of living. It requires knowledge of the proper end and of the means to it. And thus Socrates' famous principle, virtue is knowledge. Virtue is knowledge. Now what exactly did he mean by virtue is knowledge? As far as we can judge, he meant 2 quite different things. One of them, I would say, correct, the other false. Both packaged deal together in this famous statement. The first is that knowledge is a necessary condition of virtue. Knowledge, of course, of what is required for the health of the soul. And here, this is obviously correct, and there's an exact parallel, for instance, to architecture. If you don't have any knowledge, you will not be able to build sensibly. It'll simply be a matter of chance, and your building, 9 chances out of 10, will topple if you even get it up. The same thing for Socrates is true of the art of living. If you do not know the principles by which to live, you simply are going to have a life which collapses instead of a building. That's point 1 under virtuous knowledge. Apparently, however, Socrates also believed a second point under this formula, namely that knowledge is a sufficient condition of virtue. In other words, that if you know what is right, you will automatically and necessarily do it. You have no choice about it. There is no such thing as deliberate evil, simply ignorance. Now, how did he claim to prove that knowledge is all that's required and itself guarantees virtue? Well, his argument is like this. He says, everyone necessarily pursues that which he thinks is going to lead to his own welfare, to his self-interest, to his own good, to his happiness. Now, I should say here in explanation of this view of his that Socrates, along with most of the Greeks, assumed simply without question that, of course, all men are egoists and want to achieve their own happiness. This is wrong, but it simply is an evidence of the fact of the comparative health of the Greek culture. Now, if you combine that premise with Socrates' definition of virtue, namely that which is indispensable to a man's welfare, the conclusion follows unavoidably that everyone who knows what virtue is and sees that it leads to his welfare will necessarily pursue it and live the good life, because the only alternative would be he's deliberately and willfully pursuing his own destruction. And of course, according to the Greeks, that is impossible. Therefore, said Socrates, everyone who doesn't live the good life does not know the nature and rewards of virtue. Sin is simply ignorance. There's no such thing as a willful evil. Once you know the good, you cannot betray it. All wrongdoing is involuntary. And thus, you see, the urgent importance of studying philosophy for Socrates, it gives you the knowledge that makes you good, and therefore makes you healthy, and therefore makes you happy. The study of philosophy is therefore the key, the only key, to a successful life. Now, I have to literally, in a few sentences, demur from this last element of the virtuous knowledge view, the idea that it is sufficient of itself to guarantee virtue. It has had a very negative, very bad effect, this latter view, because the effect has been to wipe out the distinction between errors of knowledge and breaches of morality. There is no such thing as volitionally immoral behavior on this view, simply involuntary ignorance. And today, of course, there's all sorts of people exonerating or trying to exonerate all sorts of crimes on the grounds of, well, he couldn't help it, he wasn't educated, he didn't know any better. If he'd had the right knowledge, he would have been okay. You're familiar with that. Now, of all the possible criticisms you could make of this view, I'll confine myself to two very briefly. It assumes, first of all, as I mentioned, that all men are irrational egoists, acting always for what they believe will be their own welfare, something which is simply demonstrably false. Anyone who knew the history of Christianity, which of course Socrates didn't have the chance to know, would see that. And I don't mean to pick just on Christianity, atheists are no better. You can just look around the state of the world or read any newspaper as far as this point is concerned. To become a rational egoist is an achievement, not an innate endowment. Human beings are not determined. And of course this would be a version of determinism, Socrates' view. They're not determined to be rational or irrational, egoistic or non-egoistic. There are men who are actually indifferent to their own personal lives and happiness. There are men, if you go by the facts, who are positively eager to destroy themselves, to sacrifice themselves. Socrates' error is to project onto human nature the general pro-reason healthy egoism of the Greek civilization. It is a noble error, but it is an error. And another criticism, the fact that you know something does not mean that you will automatically apply that knowledge. You can know that something is good for you and yet refuse to allow that knowledge to come into focus. The point I give students in school, which is the perfect example of this, is you know there's going to be an exam tomorrow. You have the capacity simply to push that unpleasant fact out of your mind by an act of evasion and go out of focus. Now, you see, Socrates implies here, once you know, your knowledge must always be operative. But if you understand the objectivist theory of free will, which I wouldn't here attempt to go into, essential to free will is that you not only have to know, you have to summon your knowledge and concentrate on it in a given situation by consistent acts of focusing. This is what Socrates leaves out. So he is right that when you know that something is the correct thing, and when you volitionally focus on that fact, keep it real to yourself, then in that moment you have no choice but to act on what you know. But it doesn't follow that whenever you commit a wrong action, you didn't have the knowledge. It could very well have been the case that you had the knowledge but chose to evade it. That's inherent in free will. You can never become an automatically good person just by stuffing yourself full of enough lectures on ethics. Well, so much for Socrates' views. You see that apart from certain errors, his general view is sound if undeveloped and generalized. It's true that man has a nature. Using his terms, the soul has a nature. It's true that happiness depends on having a healthy soul, on living in accordance with your nature. That sophistic whim-worshipping is a means to guaranteed misery. And it's true that a knowledge of man's nature and requirements is indispensable to virtue and happiness. But we don't yet have anything very specific. We have to know, well, what is the specific nature of man or the soul? What are its requirements? What are the laws of happiness? What is the knowledge we need? And thus we have to turn to Plato to fill in Socrates' generalized scheme and deduce a concrete set of virtues from it.
No, Janet, we cannot afford more wars. Bloomberg Intelligence recently released an analysis showing that a year of interest payments on the national debt now exceeds $1 trillion. This should have been a wake-up call to Congress and the Biden administration, but it was largely ignored. The political and financial elites' continued failure to acknowledge the dangers posed by ever-growing national debt is exemplified by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's comment that America can and must fund both the Ukraine war and the Israel war. As a former Fed chairman, Yellen no doubt thinks it does not matter how much the U.S. government spends as long as the Fed can monetize the debt. Monetizing federal debt requires the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low. These low rates incentivize government, businesses, and private citizens to take on large amounts of debt. This may not be a problem as long as the central bank keeps rates low. However, once the central bank raises rates, many individuals, businesses, and even governments will be unable to manage their debt. Businesses will also learn they were misled by low rates into making unwise investments, creating a short-term boom, a bubble, and a crash. The most pernicious Fed-created bubble is the government bubble. The Fed's willingness to facilitate continued increased spending on war and welfare leads to massive deficits. The increased spending and the low interest rates necessary to monetize the debt will inevitably lead to a bursting of the government bubble, followed by a major economic crisis. The only reason the government bubble has not yet burst is the dollar remains the world's reserve currency. However, the dollar could soon lose that status. A collapse of the U.S. dollar empire would benefit people in countries like Ukraine and Israel because it would allow them to work for peaceful relations with their neighbors instead of having their interests sacrificed for the profits of the U.S. military-industrial complex. Some American politicians claim military spending is justified because it creates U.S. manufacturing jobs. This ignores the fact that a dollar spent creating weapons of war is a dollar that cannot be spent creating products that meet the consumer's needs and wants. The fact that the Fed's modest interest rate increases were difficult for many individuals and businesses suggests that we are nearing an end to the fiat money era that began in 1971 when Richard Nixon severed the last link between the U.S. dollar and gold. The only way to avoid a dollar crisis followed by an economic meltdown is for Congress to stop pouring money into a futile attempt to run the world and instead pursue a policy of peace and free trade with all. This will not only benefit the American people, but people around the globe. Ending the warfare state will free up resources that can be used to support those truly dependent on government programs while we unwind the welfare state and transfer to local charities and religious institutions responsibility for aid to those in need. It is no coincidence that America's transformation from a constitutional republic into a welfare warfare state that seeks to control the people's lives and run the world was not completed until the creation of the IRS and the Federal Reserve. The American people's liberty and prosperity will never be safe from power-hungry politicians and self-anointed world saviors until the income tax is repealed and the Fed is audited and ended. Thanks for listening.
So Hamas's armed wing said on Monday that it discussed with Qatari mediators a deal to free up to 70 Israeli hostages in exchange for a 5-day ceasefire and the release of some Palestinian prisoners. So this is Abu Ubaida. He's a spokesman for the Al-Qasam's brigades, which is Hamas's armed wing. And he said, quote, "Last week, there was an effort from the Qatari brothers to release the enemy captives from women and children in return for the release of 200 Palestinian children and 75 women detained by the enemy. The truce should include a complete ceasefire and allow aid and humanitarian relief everywhere in the Gaza Strip," end quote. He also accused Israel of procrastinating and evading the price of the deal. So what was interesting is that later on Monday, David Ignatius of the Washington Post, who's considered very close to the CIA, he reported that Israel and Hamas are close to a hostage deal that would free most Israeli women and children. An Israeli official told him that the general outline of the deal is understood. It's not clear if it's going to include Israel releasing any Palestinian prisoners, but this official said that Israel is hoping that up to 100 people will be released from Gaza. So there has been these kind of back-channel talks through Qatar, which is serving as a mediator. And that's one thing. William Burns, the director of the CIA, was recently in Doha, involved in these discussions about a potential hostage deal. That deal that he discussed apparently was for a 3-day ceasefire, although the U.S. doesn't want to call it a ceasefire, a 3-day pause in exchange for Hamas releasing between 10 and 15 hostages. So this is a much bigger hostage release that seems to be on the table here, because we're getting it from both sides here, that there's indication that they might actually be close to something, or at least it's being discussed. So far, though, Netanyahu has rejected deals like this. The Guardian reported last week that he rejected an earlier deal that would have involved a 5-day ceasefire in exchange for Hamas freeing children, women, the elderly, and sick people. It's not clear how many people they were talking in that potential deal. But that report said that Israel showed its rejection of the deal by launching its ground invasion of Gaza, which started on October 27th or October 28th. So Israel estimates that there are 240 Israelis being held in Gaza, most of them by Hamas, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad is holding some people. And they were captured during the October 7th Hamas attack, which killed about 1,200 Israelis. Israel initially said 1,400 people were killed, but they brought the number down to 1,200. They said that they counted some bodies that turned out to be dead Hamas fighters in with the Israelis. So far, Hamas has released 4 people. They're claiming that some hostages were killed or are missing as a result of Israeli airstrikes, but that hasn't been confirmed. So we don't know, the exact number of people that they're holding. So a group of U.S.-based aid, advocacy, and religious groups sent a letter to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin urging the Pentagon to scrap plans to provide Israel with 155mm artillery rounds due to the massive civilian casualty rate in Israel's war on Gaza. So the Pentagon plans to give the Israeli military access to 155mm artillery shells that the U.S. actually has in a special stockpile that's located in Israel. This report, it's not clear. The U.S. could have already given them access to this. Israel could already be drawing from this stockpile. The Pentagon has not been transparent at all with the type of assistance they've been providing Israel since October 7th. But this stockpile that they have in Israel, the U.S. recently dipped into it to support the proxy war in Ukraine. And there was a recent report from Axios that said the U.S. was actually diverting 155mm artillery shells initially bound for Ukraine. They were diverting them to Israel to replenish this stockpile. So this letter reads, quote, "Under the current circumstances, granting the government of Israel access to these munitions would undermine the protection of civilians, respect for international humanitarian law, and the credibility of the Biden administration. Simply put, it is difficult to imagine a scenario in which high explosive 155mm artillery shells could be used in Gaza in compliance with international humanitarian law," end quote. So tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been trained across Europe for the war with Russia. And, this is based on a report from AP that said, it painted, as Kyle said, a pretty grim picture of what the future holds for these Ukrainians. And it quoted, officials, NATO, French military officials basically saying that, they're sending them off to their death. French trainers say they are careful not to get close to the Ukrainian cadets over fears that they will be killed on the frozen front lines. The AP report said that Ukrainian soldiers preparing for the deployment have resigned themselves to the grimness of the future. So pretty bleak stuff. And it just seems like, again, kind of another sign, just the way it's being reported and framed. It's not like they're doing this great thing by training these soldiers. It sounds like they're just sending them off to be killed or maimed in this brutal war that just seems more pointless by the day.
The AstraZeneca vaccine caused a small group of individuals to suffer catastrophic injury and bereavement. To make this statement is not to dabble in anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, which, what do you mean by anti-vaccine conspiracy theory at this point? You have to describe what you mean as an anti-vaccine conspiracy theory. You're against it because of a conspiracy. This is a fact evidenced by the reports of clinicians, medical experts, and coroners across the UK. Clinicians, medical experts, and coroners, not crackpots, nut jobs, and conspiracy theorists. For those who want to maintain a narrative that vaccines do no harm, the experience of the vaccine injured and bereaved constitutes an inconvenient truth. No, they should be shamed. I was told, the legacy media told me what to do with the anti-vaxxers. Shame them. Why don't we shame these bereaved people? That we can maybe shame them into silence. And anyone who tries to propagate these ideas will just find some reason they shouldn't be able to speak either. I'm sure we can come up with something. This is a truth that to date has been easier for the government and much of the media to ignore. By beginning a legal battle against AstraZeneca, the vaccine injured and bereaved can no longer be silenced. damn. The Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine has been branded defective in a multi-million-pound landmark legal action that will suggest claims over its efficacy were vastly overstated. Not only were they vastly overstated, those claims were amplified by the media, and people that tried to challenge these vastly overstated claims were shamed and silenced, and still to this day, there are consequences for speaking out in this way. The pharmaceutical giant is being sued in the High Court in a test case by Jamie Scott, a father of two, who suffered a significant permanent brain injury that's left him unable to work as a result of a blood clot after receiving the jab in April 2021. A second claim is being brought by the widower and two young children of 35-year-old Alpa Taylor, who died after having the jab made by AstraZeneca, the UK-based pharmaceutical giant. It's interesting this man received the jab in April 2021 when it had been revealed that the AstraZeneca vaccine caused blood clots, but the WHO was still saying it was okay. If they want to introduce a global treaty that means they'll be able to mandate vaccines across the world and censor opposition to those measures, we should definitely all sign up to that right now, and definitely not sign this petition in the link below that would prevent that mad treaty. The test cases could pave the way for as many as 80 damages claims worth an estimated $80 million over a new condition known as vaccine-induced immune thrombocytopenia. It's catchy, and thrombosis, VITT. That was identified by specialists in the wake of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine rollout. The vaccine, which was heralded at its launch by Boris Johnson as a triumph for British science, is no longer used in the UK. The government recommends 3 other vaccines for its autumn booster programme. Let's not ask any questions about those then. And the idea that it's like just Boris Johnson rather than a coordinated global event to which every political party signed up is ridiculous and convenient. What this is trying to suggest is, well, if you just get rid of Boris Johnson and AstraZeneca, there's the problem solved. It's not as if there was a global campaign to prevent you from thinking or saying or daring to believe anything else. In the months following the rollout, the potential serious side effect of the AstraZeneca jab was identified by scientists. Following this, it was recommended it no longer be given to the under 40s in the UK because the risk of receiving the jab outweighed the harm posed by COVID. AstraZeneca last night told The Telegraph that patient safety was its highest priority. Is it though, or is profit the highest priority? And is patient safety a sort of byproduct, an inadvertent consequence of the pursuit of this profit? Official figures from the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, show at least 81 deaths in the UK are suspected to have been linked to the adverse reaction that caused clotting in people who also had low blood platelets. Oh, comorbidities is okay now. In total, almost 1 in 5 people who suffered from the condition died as a result, according to the MHRA's own figures. That's their figures. Official figures obtained under a Freedom of Information request show that out of 148 payouts made by the government under the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme, which provides compensation to those injured by vaccines or to bereaved next of kin, at least 144 went to recipients of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Fewer than 5 people under the scheme received vaccines other than AstraZeneca. The case will raise questions about what the UK authorities knew about concerns over the vaccine and how they were handled. An examination of WhatsApp messages sent by or to Matt Hancock, the then Health Secretary, obtained by The Telegraph as part of the lockdown files and which have been passed to the COVID public inquiry, suggests concerns were aired by US authorities. AstraZeneca never in the end applied for a licence in the US. At the time, a number of European countries were pausing the vaccine rollout over fears it caused clotting in some people. I suppose what will take place now is an attempt to minimise and mitigate the impact of this information and make it like this is an anomalous outlier. This is not some institutional thing that went on. The COVID inquiry in our country, which would not be happening without the actions, I would say, of independent media and people that were brave enough to speak out during the propaganda campaign that was fully immersive, pressurising and shaming of people that dared to have another view. What will happen now is, oh, there was a few bad actors, this vaccine didn't work, and this politician was a bit inept. This was systemic. This was coordinated. This was a global event. We're all going to have to collectively forget that there was an advertising campaign, that there was public shaming, that there were shows where vaccines danced about on the TV, where almost everyone you know anecdotally would say, yeah, this thing happened to me, and I know this person that had this happen, and morticians contributing. Why would you need to censor and control the conversation unless there was something to suppress and control?
We got to presume that there are some people listening who really don't know much about this, or maybe they heard of it one time a long time ago, but they really wouldn't know what to think at all. So can you give us sort of just the basics of what the story is that we're talking about here, kind of the date and the time and the circumstance and the basic outline of what happened?
Yeah, sure. It happened in June of 1967, which was during the Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt. And what happened was the United States National Security Agency, the NSA, at the time had a number of spy ships. These were converted sort of transport ships that have been converted into signals intelligence ships, eavesdropping ships. And there was one that was sailing along the coast of Africa. It was called the USS Liberty. And when the Six-Day War broke out, or just before that, the NSA sent the Liberty to the Mediterranean to listen to what was happening during the war. So the Liberty sailed up through the Strait of Gibraltar, then it sailed up, and it sailed off of Sinai, which was one of the scenes of a number of the battles. And while it was there, it was just in international waters, which is beyond 12-mile limit, beyond 12 miles from the coastline. And so it was listening to the events that were taking place between Israel and Egypt in that part of the world. And because of extensive antennas and so forth, it was able to pick up a great deal of communications. So on June 7th, they were just doing their normal eavesdropping, and again in international waters. And all of a sudden, there was a surveillance by a number of Israeli reconnaissance planes. They flew over fairly low and apparently took pictures, at least saw what the ship was all about. And at the time, the ship said USS Liberty on the back. There were American sailors on the deck, and it was flying an American flag. It wasn't hard to identify it. It was listed in Jane's Fighting Ships, the standard book of naval ships that the Israelis, everybody has a copy of, and it lists the USS Liberty, basically a reconnaissance ship. And so after the surveillance by the planes, then a few hours later, there was this enormous attack. It began with fighter aircraft, and they came over and they shot up. First of all, they shot the small anti-aircraft machine guns they had on the deck. I think there were only 2 of them. So they took those out, and around the same time, they also took out all the communications. They shut out the antennas. So in that first attack, they made the ship silent, for one thing, and then second of all, they took out any kind of defensive armaments. And once they did that, then the ship was basically a sitting duck there. And later on, after the initial attack by the fighters, other fighters came in and they shot up the ship with cannon fire. They dropped napalm on the ship. They did everything possible to kill it, killing a lot of people, a lot of the sailors. And then finally, the Israeli Navy sent 3 torpedo boats, and they all sat targeting the Liberty as if it was just a sitting duck, which basically it was. And they fired 5 torpedoes at the Liberty, which certainly would have taken it to the bottom. Unfortunately for them, 4 of them missed, but unfortunately for the Liberty, 1 of them hit dead center, and that killed a total of 34 people altogether. And injured in the attack, there were over 190 people injured, and so it was an attack that went on for hours. And as the sailors were trying to get off and get into lifeboats, since the ship was listing and looked like it might sink, then the Israeli Navy started shooting up the rubber lifeboats. Eventually, the ship made it back to I think it was to Malta, where the dead were removed, the injured were taken care of, and the rest were flown back to Washington. The ship was eventually scrapped because it was too badly damaged, and the Captain McGonigal, received the Medal of Honor by President Johnson. But because the U.S. government wanted to pretty much cover this up, it was presented to him not at the White House by the president, but in a sort of a back room at the U.S. Navy headquarters by a Navy official. So the crew were told not to say anything about it, and ever since then, there's largely been a cover-up by the United States government.
And the Israelis say, no, but Jim, what happened is every morning at 10, we wipe the board clean and start over and forget everything we knew. And that's actually what they really say in the IDF report, that's their standard procedure, is to wipe the board clean. And so they, of course, yes, they knew it was an American ship, but then they didn't. Do you buy that?
No. They claim they're one of the world's best intelligence organizations, military organizations, and so forth. And no, I mean, I don't. There's a ship out there. They have surveillance flights over it. It's flying an American flag. What about the planes that followed afterwards, the fighter planes? I mean, the flag was still flying. The sailors were still dressed in American sailor uniforms, and the ship still said the USS Liberty. And they attacked it. So what, were the pilots wearing blindfolds or something? So no, I don't buy that.
Well, you know what, though?
Israel has an excuse for everything.
Yeah.
Just like most governments, and most, if you go to the Pentagon and tell them that something bad happened, the first thing they're going to come out with some defensive explanation. Oh, that didn't really happen, or it happened because of this or that. So that's what governments do. It's called propaganda.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
A COVID-19 vaccine reckoning is coming for the DOJ over federal mandates. Dude, this was an interesting article from the New York Post. And while we're on medical topics, why not plug premierpharma.com? If you're out there, you got a doctor's office, you got an independent pharmacy, that kind of thing, you hit up premierpharma.com. You can start hooking up your patients with cheaper generic drugs. All right, article from the New York Post. A COVID-19 vaccine reckoning is coming for the DOJ over federal mandates. The Justice Department has just posted a new job, and it's looking for 8 new attorneys to defend the federal government in vaccine injury cases. Presumably, the hiring spree is in anticipation of a surge of COVID vaccine lawsuits, as people who were forced by government mandates to take the jab and suffered serious side effects as a result try to extract compensation from a system that is stacked against them. The office is currently expanding to address workload created by an increase in cases filed under the Vaccine Act. Obviously, it's too late to make a real impact, and these people were still forced. But it's nice. I think in New York, people won back pay. And you also have the problem of how do you define force if people were just intimidated and they went and did it, who actually was like forced, out of their job. They're very good at the just intimidation tactics to make it seem as if you were forced. With all that said, I thought that this was interesting, that government might be having to reckon with quite a few court cases, and it would be nice to see them rack up some losses and then maybe actually have to prosecute some individuals. You know what? Let's talk bonds, and then we can talk special. You've got I've seen this happen before, but the agencies are starting to downgrade U.S. debt. Now, some people like to go, hey, U.S. debt's the benchmark, so if it doesn't matter. If it slides to B, B's now the gold standard. Everything else is a C or a D. If it goes to F, everything's negative F. It doesn't matter. I'm more of the mentality that we're running a big-ass scam here. At some point, we're going to pay the bill for the big-ass fucking scam. And anytime you get these little signals of someone going, hey, this is a big-ass fucking scam, you're inching closer to more people awakening to it and looking to move away from, basically lending us money. So I hand it back to you as the actual financial professional, cash daddies. You can get your tips. You can start shorting the VIX, up in the VIX, making money even in down markets. I hand it to you. What do you make of the U.S. bond rating change?
I mean, it's not the first time. It's there's 3 bond rating agencies. You have Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. And look, in 2011, I think it was a bigger downgrade. It might have been, I think it was Fitch in 2011 that downgraded the bonds, the debt, everything. And in 2011, after that big downgrade, the NASDAQ went from 2,800 to where it is now, 13,700.
You mean the biggest increase ever?
What's that? 7-fold. It went up 7% since then. And that was after the big downgrade in 2011. The Dow was at 12,500. It's now at 34,200.
To push back on this, though, you're talking about the period of quantitative easing. And so the Fed, really stepping into the market and flooding it with money to make it look like everything's okay. So you are running up against, first is we've got a problem already of servicing our debt, that the interest on it is a much higher percentage.
Well, that's why I got down here. You just said it.
And we're having a hard time finding buyers. So
they're not really. There's tons of buyers. Watch how much China buys over the next 3 to 6 months.
I thought China's been kind of out of the market of buying our debt.
You wait and watch. I don't think that's going to be an issue. But you did say, I agree with you 1,000%. The reason for this downgrade is you got rates this high,
right?
Which have actually come down this week. The 10-year Treasury was at 5%. Now it's down to 4.6. It's dropping. And the Fed's probably going to raise rates one more time. I think they will, another quarter basis. So they've been tightening the shit out of this. But the main downgrade is this. Look, over the past 16 years, so you say 20 years, every president that's been in office, is spending more than the previous one. I mean, old Donnie Trump had no problem writing a check for everything.
Right.
He spent more goddamn money than anyone did.
Right.
And this guy, and basically this ratings review came out today, and we said, we're downgrading you for this. Rates are too high. This has got to be the biggest ass clown Congress that we've ever had. Ever. I mean, these guys are just fucking idiots. I mean, on both sides. It's like, look, you have till Friday to get something done. These clowns, and this poor speaker doesn't know what he got himself into. because nobody will do anything that he says. His own boys don't support him. So that's the main reason they're downgrading, because they're like, look, you have to cut this deficit. You got to make an attempt. You got to cut something. Nobody's cut anything in 20 years? I want to say a real cut. So that's the downgrade. And they do, even though, look, they downgraded. What did the market do? The market went up. The market was like this, it's not going to, and it's not really going to affect anything. But what it should do is it should wake some of these guys up to say, we're now looking worse than we looked 2 weeks ago, which was pretty bad. So I think that's the main reason for the downgrade. What will happen going forward? I don't know. I mean, I think in the spring they'll start easing rates again. Tomorrow's the biggest number of the year. You got the CPI number coming out tomorrow. If that thing is north of 3.3%, the market will tell you. You'll see a sell-off. If they think things are still hot. So there's a lot of news coming out. But
so you think? I mean, this is just my ADD. But do you think next time the Feds raise rates, that's the last time they're doing so, and that's going to be your last time to pick up like a 5% bond?
Yeah, I do. No, don't get me wrong. They could raise rates, and you could see bonds go to 5.5%, 6%. That could happen.
Right.
The way it works is they'll raise rates, interest rates will go up, and then they'll talk about lowering rates in the spring, and rates will still go up. They'll still go up a little bit more because the pendulum is so big right now.
Right. All right. Now,
welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
It's critical is because the bulwark for us in the Mideast, it's almost like having an aircraft carrier in the Mideast. It's our oldest ally. It's been our ally for 75 years. It has been an incredible ally for us in terms of the technology, the exchange. And, in building the Iron Dome, which we paid a lot for, has also taught us enormously about how to defend ourselves from missiles. So those military expenditures are all going, 75% of it goes to U.S. companies under the agreement, under the MOU.
Okay, Bobby. So basically what you're saying is it's okay. It's okay because Israel is an aircraft carrier in the Middle East, and 75% of the money that we send them goes right back into the pockets of the military-industrial complex. Well, how do you do, Mr. Anti-War Left? That's your justification. Goodness gracious, man. So disappointing. And, I've been thinking about this for a couple months now, ever since since RFK Jr. was sitting down with a bunch of rabbis because he was being accused of anti-Semitism for nothing, because he was saying that that COVID may have been more potent for certain, genetic lineages and things like that, which, by the way, I don't even know if it's true, but it's certainly not anti-Semitic. So for a few months now, he has been taking the side of the regime in a way that I find to be bizarre. And so today, Alex Jones had this thesis that RFK Jr. was essentially there to undermine the Democrats because he's so upset with them and just the regime broadly, and that he's there to run to the left of Biden so that he can absorb votes from Biden and ultimately usher Trump back into the White House. This is the thesis. I don't agree. I don't think that's what's happening here at all. So I wanted to lay out kind of my reasoning, my rationale. First off, if you're going to run to the left of Joe Biden, well, wouldn't it be really prudent for you to be on the side of Palestine? Isn't that what the streets are filled with? Is largely Democrat voters, college kids it's all ages, but lots of young, revolutionary type spirits are out in the streets right now. And you're telling me that he's there to steal votes from Biden by running to the left of Biden, but yet he's about as pro-Israel as it gets. I don't think so. I don't think that math checks out. I don't. I also don't understand why a guy who has been, he really made his name over the past year or 6 months or whatever it was since he announced by telling the truth, as best as I can tell, about what happened to his father and his uncle, JFK and RFK, and who was responsible. CIA, FBI, Mafia, whoever else participated. It doesn't add up to me that a guy who thinks that basically his entire family has been threatened, some of them have been murdered by the CIA and the FBI, by his own beliefs, would put his daughter-in-law as his campaign manager, replace Dennis Kucinich, who's actually a good anti-war Democrat for the most part, and put in a former CIA agent as his campaign manager. What? Look, I know it's one thing to keep family close, but wouldn't that kind of be a non-starter? If you genuinely believe that the CIA is responsible for these things, why would you have anyone that is in any way connected to that organization run your campaign? Run it. What? Why would you be on the side of Israel, given that you have to know that the Mossad functions very similarly to the CIA? Well, my suspicion, and it's a strong one, unfounded as it may be, is that there's some sort of compromise here. Compromise being held over him. He's compromised, is what I'm saying. That's my suspicion. Can I prove it? No. Am I right? Probably. I'm probably right. Because it just doesn't make any sense to me for, this renegade anti-war leftist, which is, a dying breed, to put it mildly. He's allegedly out there to steal votes from Joe Biden, running to the left of Joe Biden, but yet he is standing arm in arm with Israel as they blow up 5,000 kids over the past month. Doesn't add up. If you're anti-war, why are you concerned with Israel being an aircraft carrier? Why? Why do we need an aircraft carrier in the Middle East if you're actually anti-war? Odd, right? If you're opposed to the military-industrial complex, as your dad and uncle allegedly were, why would you discount the fact that billions and billions of dollars are sent to Israel that are then funneled back into military-industrial complex contractors' pockets? How would that be a positive? How is that good at all? Why should I feel as if that money's better spent just because it's being funneled back to some of the worst corporations on earth in human history? Why is that a positive? Why is it a positive that I'm being robbed for them to become more wealthy and more innocent people to die? What kind of an anti-war leftist position is that to hold? Strange. It's a strange one is the answer. Maybe he's just unprincipled. Sure, maybe. I don't know. But all of these line up and have me asking real questions as to who this guy is and why he's up there. Now, I've been very positive about him because I thought he was great on COVID, and I thought he was great in shedding light on what the CIA and the FBI might really be about. And I was very hopeful that he's the real deal. And I'm still hopeful that he's the real deal. But what is this? What is this? What are these policy positions? So you can argue the anti-war, non-interventionist, blowback position when it comes to Russia invading Ukraine, and you do it well. But you can't wrap your head around the true history between Israel and Palestine? You can't even give an effort in understanding that? Or are your incentives stacked up to make sure that you take the other position? Because that's what it looks like to me.
That is Dave DeCamp. Dave, welcome to our program today.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Paul and Daniel. It's really great to be here.
Very good. And you've been working for a few years with anti-war, right?
That's right. I've been in the role that I fill now as the news editor. I started doing that full time in 2020. I first started sending them submissions in about 2018 and 2019, and got along with them, Eric Garrison, Scott Horton, really well. And it was a good working relationship, and I was lucky enough to be able to do it full time.
Yes, I want you to tell me what former education you had, what university you went to. But as you tell us about that, I'm interested also in, did you have a special professor or anybody teach you that led you into thinking maybe freedom is a big issue and maybe I ought to look into it?
So I actually went to college in the Bronx. I went to SUNY Maritime College, which was a school where you go and you get your merchant mariner's license to work on ships. So completely unrelated to what I do for a living now. We would go out every summer on a training ship, or go across the ocean to Europe, and those experiences definitely impacted me. And you can do a lot of thinking, when you're sitting in the middle of the ocean. And after college, I worked on ferries. First, I worked on the Port Jeff ferry on Long Island, which is where I'm from, is Long Island. And then I worked on the Staten Island ferry in New York City. And it was funny because that was when I became a libertarian, was when I was working for New York City on the ferry. And the way I got there was I always considered myself very anti-war. I kind of considered myself a leftist just because those were the people that I saw in front of me that were more anti-war. And it was my time at the ferry that I started listening to the Scott Horton show and watching this show, The Liberty Report. This show actually had a pretty amazing impact on me. I've always been a fan of Ron Paul, the politician, and actually read End the Fed, when it first came out. And I remember thinking, yeah, that all makes sense. But the anti-war stuff was always what drove me the most. And it was during the early years of the Trump administration when he ramped up airstrikes, everywhere. He was supporting this brutal war in Yemen. And nobody was talking about it. Everybody was talking about Russiagate and Stormy Daniels, kind of all this superficial stuff. And Russiagate, which was complete nonsense. So I was really impressed to see you and Daniel covering this stuff, being consistent and principled with your non-interventionism. And it was that, and again, Scott Horton and Eric Garris just speaking with them, and Justin Raimondo, reading all of his writing, kind of digging into the archives at antiwar.com, that I became a libertarian, and I like the principle of non-intervention, and I believe, freedom. I've always been very freedom-minded. Thanks to working for antiwar.com, I got out of New York City, and now we live out in the country down in Virginia, and I feel much more free. So it's all very compatible with the way I always wanted to live, freedom-minded, and the anti-war stuff was always kind of what drove me the most, because I saw it kind of as the most morally wrong, the most obvious, evil thing that our government does.
If you're sitting there in India or in the so-called global South anywhere, and you see this hypocrisy in Western institutions that are primarily funded by the U.S., not particularly the ICC, but certainly the UN funded by the U.S., and so hypocritical, so incapable of an even-handed approach. I mean, it's something really to behold. I don't know if you have those same impressions.
Yeah, well, I think the hypocrisy, to a lot of these countries, that they call the global South, or whatever you want to call it, global majority, some people call it.
Yeah.
I think during the Ukraine war, to them, to a lot of people in Africa, it was already hypocritical of the U.S. to be going out there and lecturing Russia. But since this Gaza war, I mean, it's become even more apparent to much more people now. I mean, you had Blinken and Sullivan coming out and talking about the rules-based international order. And now that they're backing this war that's killing so many children, thousands and thousands of children, they come out. You had the White House, the National Security Council spokesman, John Kirby, I know you covered this, coming out and saying, yeah, many, many thousands of innocents have been killed in this war. It is what it is.
It happens, yeah.
And this guy, John Kirby, what really gets me about him, there was a press conference when he was, I think, at the Pentagon talking about Russia's war, talking about some civilians that were killed, and he got choked up.
He started crying.
Yeah. And there was another interview right after the Hamas attack talking about Israeli civilians that were killed. He started crying.
Turn
I think
on
it
the
was
tears,
CNN.
baby.
And then he comes out and he says, yeah, they're killing thousands of innocent people. Lots of children are being killed. That it is what it is.
Yeah. Sick.
So you see that, and it's just so, it really lays bare the hypocrisy for many more people to see, I think.
Yeah.
Dave, I want to ask the question about how people treat you. You go out and you're challenging the status quo, and I have a little bit of an experience with that and how people respond to what we're saying. And generally speaking, can you say, is there a special way the people who don't like what you're saying, what's the matter with you, and they want to get to you, is there something that they use more often than another to try to put you down or argue against you? What is the most common thing that they try to make you look like you're believing in, but you really don't?
Well, the very common smear is that, if I'm talking about Ukraine and why the U.S. shouldn't be involved, that means I'm pro-Putin, pro-Russia. I try to focus a lot on China. People call me, an apologist for the Chinese government, say I'm pro-China and that I hate America. Why don't you just go move to China? And now, of course, it's that I'm pro-Hamas. That's always the smear. It was the smear during the Iraq war protests. You were pro-Saddam. But looking back, those people that protested against the war, like you, were vindicated. The people that were against it were vindicated. And, so they could throw all these smears at me, but I just know it's not true. And especially from my perspective, again, since I've become more of a libertarian, and I'm talking about these issues kind of from the context of what would benefit us, what would benefit Americans. We would be much better off if we didn't have this world empire. So, to call me, it's just kind of laughable to say that I'm pro-Hamas, that somehow I'm working for Hamas or working for China or working for Russia, when it's clear that, I care about this country. That's why I live here. I have kids, I'm very serious about this. This isn't, I used to be, years ago, I used to be kind of more, again, just kind of anti-American, maybe just but now it's really changed for me, that I am, especially since I've had kids, and I really do care about the future of this country, and I do love this country. So to say that I'm doing this on behalf of any foreign power is just completely ridiculous.
That's one thing that libertarianism helps you with. You say, well, yeah, I love my country, but I hate the government.
And first, what then is Plato's view of the nature of man, the nature of the soul? And thus you can title this, if you're taking notes, Plato's psychology. Now that does not mean the workings of his mind. It means his theory of the nature of the soul, the nature of man. Psyche, P-S-Y-C-H-E, is the Greek for soul, and therefore psychology is literally theory of the soul. You can think of it as theory of the personality, theory of the spiritual, psychological component of man. Now, to understand Plato's psychology, you need to remember his metaphysics. There is a sharp dualism between the world of perfect forms and the world of Heraclitean particulars. Now, according to Plato, man is a creature who has ties to both worlds. He is a composite creature of two parts, soul and body. His soul, or his reason, belongs to another world. It came from there. It's non-material. Its essential function is to study the forms. But in this life, the soul is encased in the body. And as a result, man has drives, urges, desires that a disembodied soul would never have. He has loves and lusts for physical things. In a word, there is a part of man which urges him up to the world of forms, to study, to think, to philosophize, and there is a part which pulls him down to this world, the part influenced by the body. And therefore there must be two parts to man's personality, or two parts to the soul, if you like to call it that, reflecting the two different worlds. Man, for Plato, is a dualistic creature. He has a higher nature and a lower nature. All men. His higher nature is his reason, or call it his mind, the thinking part, the part that studies the forms and acquires knowledge. His lower nature is the irrational element in him, and that is the emotions, the feelings. Those, says Plato, are always feelings and emotions for things in this world, for the sensible world. And notice you do not feel passions for abstract forms. Emotions and desires are inherently this worldly. They're directed to particulars. You may feel a craving lust for bananas, but nobody feels a lust for bananahood, you see. So on this point, he's right. Emotions are directed to particulars. Now, these two elements, according to Plato, are present in every man. They are fundamentally independent of each other and, in fact, opposed components, making up the essence of man's soul. Now, notice they are opposed by nature. What is the proof of that? Well, it's what you can call the argument from conflict, which Plato puts forth in the Republic and which has been going like a house of fire ever since. It's perhaps best illustrated by the story of Philip and Mildred in Of Human Bondage, supposedly illustrating the eternal conflict between man's reason and his passions. If you know that story, which I certainly don't propose to tell now except in one sentence, it amounts to Philip is an artist, and he meets Mildred, a green-tinted slut from the gutter, who, intellectually speaking, he finds repulsive, and yet he is caught in helpless emotional bondage to her. On the other hand, he meets Nora, a nice girl that he intellectually approves of, and he's completely indifferent to her sexually, emotionally. And he runs through the book wailing about the eternal plight of man. His emotions pull him one way and his reason the other. Now, there's 10,000 such examples that the followers of Plato have written, and I don't have to multiply them. Plato's argument is if a man like this is urged in two opposite directions at the same time, there must be two different opposite parts at work, two independent, autonomous, motivating sources, one pushing one way and one the other. Now you see here the influence of Plato's metaphysics. Because if you held a one-reality metaphysics, you would never come to such a conclusion. You could easily account for conflicts without taking emotions as irrational elements severed from reason and functioning independently. You would do it by reference to contradictory ideas, contradictory premises which a person holds. And you would say the person holds a contradiction, he is in intellectual conflict, and one half is usually not within his conscious awareness, but in principle, if he introspects properly, engages in self-analysis, perhaps goes to psychotherapy, he will be able to bring it all to the surface, get rid of the contradiction, restore harmony to his emotional life, and proceed about his business. But if you come to man in advance with the metaphysics of dualism and conflict, you will find that conflict in man also. And for Plato, therefore, in every man's soul there is a basic conflict of reason versus emotion.
More than 400 U.S. officials from 40 government agencies have sent a letter to President Biden criticizing his unconditional support for Israel's war in Gaza. And this is the latest example of dissent from within the U.S. government over this policy of backing this brutal onslaught in Gaza. So this letter reads, quote, "We call on President Biden to urgently demand a ceasefire and to call for de-escalation of the current conflict by securing the immediate release of the Israeli hostages and arbitrarily detained Palestinians, the restoration of water, fuel, electricity, and other basic services, and the passage of adequate humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip," end quote. So two members of the Israeli Knesset, that's their parliament, wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal arguing for Western countries to take in refugees from Gaza as Israeli officials continue to call for Palestinians to be pushed out of the territory. So this op-ed was written by Danny Danon, who's a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, and Ram Ben Barak, a member of the opposition party Yesh Atid, which is led by former Prime Minister Yair Lapid. So the ruling party and the main opposition party unite to tell Europe and the US to take in Palestinian refugees. They wrote, quote, "One idea is for countries around the world to accept limited numbers of Gazan families who have expressed a desire to relocate," end quote. And they listed examples of conflicts where Europe and the US accepted refugees, including the wars in former Yugoslavia and Syria. They said, quote, "Looking to these examples, countries around the world should offer a haven for Gaza residents who seek relocation," end quote. They concluded the op-ed by saying that the international community has a moral imperative to accept refugees from Gaza, as Israel is killing all of these Palestinian children. They're saying this. So this op-ed drew praise from Bezalel Smotrich, and he is an extremist settler who is in Netanyahu's government. He leads the religious Zionist party, and he is Israel's finance minister, and he also has a lot of control now over settlements, expanding settlements in the West Bank. He said, quote, "I welcome the initiative of members of Knesset, Ram Ben Barak and Danny Danon, on the voluntary immigration of Gaza Arabs to the countries of the world. This is the right humanitarian solution for the residents of Gaza and the entire region," end quote. So Smotrich said that other countries accepting refugees from Gaza is the only solution that will bring an end to the suffering. He added, quote, "The state of Israel will no longer be able to put up with the existence of an independent entity in Gaza," end quote. So it's very clear that the name of the game for these members of this Netanyahu government and many members of the Israeli parliament is to push all these Palestinians out of Gaza and take over the territory. It's clearly what they want to do. So expectations are low for the meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping that will take place on Wednesday in San Francisco during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. That's the APEC Summit. The New York Times reported Tuesday that Biden officials have said one potential agreement that might be made is to resume military-to-military communication channels that were suspended in the wake of then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan in August 2022. But even the increase in military dialogue is not guaranteed. The U.S. has previously framed its efforts to restore the communication channels as guardrails to manage the frequent encounters between the two militaries in the South China Sea and near Taiwan. From China's perspective, the U.S. effort to establish these guardrails will normalize the increasing U.S. military presence in the region. So the South China Morning Post reported that when China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Washington last week, he scoffed when asked about military-to-military guardrails, saying that the best guardrail would be the U.S. adhering to the historical commitments that it made regarding Taiwan. In recent years, the U.S. has significantly increased military and diplomatic support for Taiwan, including providing military aid this year for the first time since the U.S. severed relations with Taiwan to formally establish ties with China, which officially happened in 1979. And then Kurt Campbell, who is the top Asia official on the National Security Council, and he's actually the nominee now to be Deputy Secretary of State. He's a real China hawk. He started what they called the Asia pivot during the Obama administration, and he had a quote, saying what he wants Biden to say in this summit. He said that the best thing for the U.S. to do is to, quote, "make it clear and to demonstrate to the Chinese that we still have staying power, that we are still the most powerful country, and we are still committed to our larger purpose in the Indo-Pacific," end quote. So that's the message he wants Biden to deliver to Xi Jinping. And China views all the U.S. efforts of building up its military, building up its alliances in the Asia-Pacific as containment aimed at China. And Xi Jinping has made that very clear in comments earlier this year. He said, quote, "Western countries led by the U.S. have implemented comprehensive containment, encirclement, and suppression against us, bringing unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development," end quote. And those comments were significant because before that, he would only kind of vaguely reference the U.S. and not name them directly when he said things like that. But there he kind of called it out.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries followed Johnson at the podium and expressed his support for President Joe Biden's joint financial aid packages that would support both Israel and Ukraine. Aid packages? Fucking more weapons of death. And that cocksucker, Johnson, he calls him I'm a devout Christian. What Christ are you talking about? What Christ are you talking about? That wouldn't want to cease fire and want to keep slaughtering people. And all you other people sending more weapons of death. And you sell your religious bullshit? Shove it up your ass. So on to the Trends Journal and the market. So they're booming. The markets are booming. Because the inflation numbers came out, they were 0.1% less than what the street anticipated. And the markets boomed. And they're booming this month. And the boom may keep going because here's the deal. We had forecast that they're going to lower interest rates in 2024 in the run-up to the presidential reality show because they want to keep the people in power in power. The Fed head, Janet Yellen, was a former Fed head. Janet Yellen is now our Treasury Secretary. They're going to lower interest rates. The EU is going to lower interest rates. The ECB, they're going to keep lowering them. So what's going on? Yeah, the markets went up. Hey, did you see where gold went? Oh, yeah. Gold had a nice boom, too. As forecast in your Trends Journal, the lower interest rates go, The deeper the dollar falls, the higher gold prices go. Oh, forget about the information that came out on Friday of Moody's downgrading America's debt. Doesn't mean anything. No. We could keep building more and more debt up. More and more debt. And I want to mention this too about this war shit. They don't put anybody out there speaking for peace. The little fucking scumbag clowns on Fox and Friends. Fox and Friends. They had Netanyahu on. You ready for the headline? America is next if Israel loses war. Netanyahu. America's next? What the fuck do we have to do over there? Oh, we got to get them ISISes. Got to melt them all over the world. Islamic militants will pose a threat to the United States and Europe if Israel loses its current war with Hamas, Netanyahu claims. Netanyahu implored Israel allies for support during a sit-down with Fox News' Sean Hannity, stating, quote, "We have to win not only for our sake, but for the sake of the Middle East." Hey, fuck you. Fuck you. And everybody forgets. Nobody knows. Everybody asks are the 39 weeks of judicial reform protests. They hated Netanyahu over in Israel. They called it a civil war. But as I say, when all else fails, they take you to war. And he's taking you to war. It goes on. We have to win to protect Israel. We have to win to safeguard the Middle East. The Middle East? You think the Middle East? You think Saudi Arabia gives a fuck about this? Yemen? Qatar? Iraq? Iran? They could care less. We have to win for the sake of the civilized world. Civilized world as you're murdering, slaughtering people in front of everybody's eyes. Civilized. The trend is your friend, and we're giving you everything we can. So again, our forecasts, would I have thought the market should have gone up this high in November? Nope. Would not have thought that. Again, we said it would go down in September and October. We didn't make a forecast in November because we felt it was up in the air. But we are forecasting they're going to keep lowering interest rates. Gold, silver prices are going to spike. And where we're going on Bitcoin is still bullish. But none of this is going to matter if the World War III continues to heat up. We got maniacs in charge. And again, take a look at this week's cover. Cannot be clearer. Follow your political leader. Do what you're told. You're nothing more than a piece of shit. I want to make this really clear. I was not put on this earth to be led by anybody. I don't lead. I don't want anybody to lead me. If you want to be led, go. We have political freaks telling us what to do. Look what they did with the COVID war. Close down your business. Stand 6 feet apart. Put that mask on when you're in an airplane, but you can take it off when you're eating and drinking. Stupid fucking shit. Making young people not go to school. When the numbers are, it's less or around 2,000 1 to 17-year-olds died in America out of 73 million from COVID. These are political fucking freaks. These are low-life scumbags who do nothing but suck off the public tit. And they forgot 2 words: public servant. Got it? So support us. We're supporting you. Subscribe to the Trends Journal. You get history before it happens. Very simple. You go to trendsjournal.com.
Over the weekend, the Washington Post, the mouthpiece for the CIA, released a crazy story that a Ukrainian colonel now in jail in Kyiv because of somebody dying in a botched effort to get a Russian pilot to defect, the facts in which with which I'm unfamiliar. There he is in the holding cell in a Kyiv courtroom, claims that he was the orchestrator of the demolition of the Nord Stream pipeline. This, of course, is absurd. Cy Hirsch doesn't give it any credibility at all, nor does anybody except those who slavishly follow the CIA. But why would the CIA release this now?
Well, again, I think there's a lot of politics being attached to the Nord Stream pipeline destruction because winter is coming, and nations are once again called upon to reflect that they have insufficient gas supplies, that if there is a cold winter, they're in deep trouble. They're in deep trouble nonetheless because businesses are closing. Germany has another major car parts manufacturer laying off people right now, holiday season, just like everything else, bad time, because they can't afford to stay in business because the energy costs have become prohibitive. Jobs are fleeing Germany, businesses are fleeing Germany, and there is a political problem. And if you're the German government, people are starting to ask the question, why did you let Joe Biden blow it up? Because remember, people have to keep this in mind. Joe Biden stood in the White House back in February of 2022 and told the assembled press right in front of Olaf Scholz that if Russia moves into Ukraine, the Nord Stream pipeline is going to be taken down. That was the president of the United States saying that.
Here it is.
Yeah.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
Okay, but how will you do that exactly? Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
It's more. Look, the CIA doesn't care about anybody but the CIA. And Cy Hirsch's story put them and some covert aspects of the Department of Defense in a spotlight they didn't want. And so they ran with a cover story, regardless of the damage it does. They don't care about anything except protecting the CIA. You can bring on Mr. Devine, and he will tell you that's the truth. The CIA takes care of the CIA before it takes care of anything else.
A member of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet by the name of Amichai Eliyahu recently gave a radio interview in Israel, which gave the distinct impression that the Netanyahu government has available to it and might consider, I think his phrase was, that's one way to do it, or that's one way, the use of nuclear weapons to degrade, destroy, and demolish Gaza. This may sound like a ridiculous question. You're the world-class UN nuclear inspector. Does Israel have nuclear weapons?
Of course they do. They've admitted having nuclear weapons. They have a policy of deliberate ambiguity, meaning that they officially won't say we have the weapons until they do. For instance, in 2004, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon all but admitted that he put Israel in a class of nuclear weapons states. In 2006, Omer, the other prime minister, came after him, did the same thing, spoke about Israel as a nuclear power. Israel has on occasions brought out their, in the Gulf War, 1991, Israel trotted out the Jericho missile and fired it, a test fire from their launch site into the Mediterranean, the exact range between Israel and Baghdad, letting the Iraqis know that if they fire chemical warheads or biological warheads into Israel, Israel will respond with a nuclear weapon. So Israel has alluded to this, but the whole purpose of deliberate ambiguity is to create unknown, because it's political. In fact, we knew Israel was developing a nuclear weapon. We knew from the very beginning. JFK knew, Lyndon Johnson knew, Richard Nixon knew.
Ben Gurion lied to JFK. I mean, that's a historical fact.
Well, he lied, but then he came and told the truth. He said, what he said is, we won't, and then Golda Meir did the same thing. They said, we won't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Now, some people say, well, that means they're not going to build them. But when pressed, Golda Meir's people said, no, possession doesn't mean introduce. So they're very clear about that. Possessing a nuclear weapon doesn't mean we've introduced it. It's only introduced when we publicly say it is and have demonstrated it exists. So the Israel concept is they can build nuclear weapons, they can have nuclear weapons, but they haven't introduced them until they've admitted they have them and they're preparing to use them, which is why this minister's statement caused so much problem, because we're at a point right now where Israel is coming close to the conditions under which they may have to acknowledge having nuclear weapons. If Hezbollah gets involved and if Iran gets involved, we're looking at a scenario where Israel could suffer strategic defeat. And the Samson option, which is, of course, the deterrence model under which the Israeli nuclear weapon exists, it doesn't exist as a battlefield support weapon or things like that. It exists if Israel is about to go down, they will take everybody out. That's the whole concept, that they will hit Tehran, they will hit Cairo, they will hit Amman, they will hit Damascus, they'll hit Beirut, they'll hit Ankara, they'll hit anybody they want to, because they're basically saying, this is Samson taking down the temple, man. We're not going to go down alone. If we go down, you all go down. Therefore, we don't go down.
Some detail. The European Parliament and the majority of the member states reached a provisional agreement on the establishment of the European Digital ID, or EID, the first central and fully digital identification system for all Europeans, on Thursday. Conservative lawmakers and cybersecurity experts are sounding the alarms, citing concerns for potential large-scale abuse. We are taking a fundamental step so that citizens can have a unique and secure European digital identity, Nadia Calvino, the Spanish Minister for Economy and Digitalization, representing the European Council Spanish presidency, said. When there are ongoing migrant crises, when there are feelings of broad antipathy towards migrants, a digital ID becomes appealing. It will be one of the ways that a variety of people will be induced into accepting a continent-wide digital ID. Oh, well, otherwise people that shouldn't even be here will be able to have access to. It's going to be for safety. They'll use every single trick that is because of paedophile. Any imaginable, conceivable notion will be used to legitimize it and normalize it. This process is beginning now. Under the new law, the EU will offer citizens so-called digital wallets on a voluntary basis. At first, what a key phrase. Why don't you have a digital wallet? Is it voluntary? Yes, it is. Now, where is your digital wallet? Oh, I left it at home. Well, then you're going to jail. Which will contain digital versions of their ID cards, driving licenses, diplomas, medical records, and bank account information. These documents will be recognized as means to access online services throughout Europe, and citizens will be able to prove their identity or share electronic documents from their wallets with a click of a button, the legislators hope. So safe, so convenient, so easy. We've already been introduced to ideas, using phones to pay for stuff, train tickets, using phones to make purchases. And of course, convenience is, a thing, it's a factor. But what are you giving up in exchange for that convenience? Where could it go? Remember, we've already had instances where people's bank accounts have been shut down, whether that's the Canadian truckers. We've already had instances where people's movements are monitored and controlled. Is that a capacity that you want to increase without due regulation and legislation? Notice it's taking place as well in a broad climate of censure and legislation to prohibit free speech. Notice that there's been a 180 on the efficacy and value of CBDCs. That initially they were dismissed. Now it's like, oh no, they are a good idea actually, thinking about it, because we could switch people off financially. It's important to consider how these things might be used and whether or not they're going to be accompanied with legislation that meaningfully prevents them from being exploited. Just look at the 702 bill that's being perpetuated in the USA now, which was introduced for counter-terrorism measures, that's never really gone away and is used essentially to spy on American citizens. Critics, however, see the EID as a building block of a coming European digital surveillance state, a way for the EU and any government to hold all of their citizens' personal information and track their every move. That sort of thing already happens. Do you remember when we were all like, God, yes, security cameras are everywhere now? Do you remember that? They didn't used to be CCTV, but it's for your security, it's for your safety, it's normalised. Now that's just a thing that we all live with. Here's the next wave. The agreement was reached just days after 504 privacy and cybersecurity experts from 39 countries signed a joint letter strongly warning about the pitfalls of the legislation, as it fails to properly respect the right to privacy of citizens and secure online communications. The researchers and academics concluded that instead of protecting personal data, the current text substantially increases the potential for harm, both by rogue actors and government abuse. Curious that that potential would exist. Naturally, the Commission does not plan to stop at EIDs. Another major plan that's currently in the works is the digital euro, Europe's future central bank issued digital currency, CBDC, currently in early development phase by the European Central Bank. So centralized global organizations collaborating with one another, able to make a set of decisions, usually in response to crises, global crisis, this being a globalist misadventure that's being undertaken, that slowly legitimize measures that are always about introducing a bit more control. CBDCs, more control. Digital ID, more control. Under the skin, more control. 15-minute cities, more control. Ability to stop people traveling, more control. Lockdowns, curfews, unpersoning people, censoring people, cancellations of people, controlling media, censoring big tech. What do you think all these things have in common? It doesn't seem to stack up, does it, anymore? There are a few questions that need to be looked at. Excess, death, injury. There's a lot of things that are indicators and clues that it's actually about control rather than care. I've said to you before on this channel that control and care does have a crossover in a natural family dynamic. I have to a degree, control my children as part of my care. And that's even on the level of an adult with children. That's a kind of a negotiation and poses moral questions. But it can just about work in anthropologically well understood groups. When you practice this at scale, when you move power away from people, when all the time you use the language of compassion, the nomenclature of kindness and convenience to alienate us from our conditions and essentially grant centralized authority the right to make decisions far, far away from you. And particularly when it's done like, oh, look at this migrant crisis, we have to have digital ID. Let's grant people a universal basic income, but I'm afraid you're going to have to eat your rice. Nicey, nicey, ricey, ricey. How do you like your rice? Embedded in my skin. That's how I like it. So I would say remain alert and vigilant to any measures that centralize authority and control in broad ways, particularly if it's posed as somehow protecting or helping you, but places that power beyond the reach of your personal authority and integrity. Because I don't think these institutions' primary concern is your convenience and safety. I think it's absolute control. But
The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, so
Wall Street, I think, has it completely wrong in looking at today's inflation data, or at least the government's version of inflation, and thinking that this means that the new bull market in stocks is here because the Fed is done hiking, and the fact the Fed is going to start cutting, and who knows, we may even get back down to zero. That might be the hope that springs eternal for the market. And one of the other reasons that the hikes are, or that Wall Street thinks the hikes are coming to an end, is that the economy is clearly weakening. So you have a weakening economy, and now, at least as far as Wall Street's concerned, you've got this so-called benign inflation report because it was 1/10 less than expected. Now, of course, it didn't surprise, to the upside. It could have very easily have been worse than expected. So maybe there was a relief rally too, that it wasn't worse than expected. It was better than expected, and we got a rally. But it's wrong to conclude anything from these numbers. Certainly that the Fed is winning the war on inflation. That is a war that it cannot win. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but one that should be obvious is what happened to the dollar today. The dollar got killed today. Why did it get killed? Because the markets think the Fed is winning the inflation war. And so paradoxically, they don't want dollars. See, the paradox is they wanted dollars when inflation was a problem and the Fed was fighting it. That's when they should have wanted to get rid of dollars. Because by definition, inflation means the dollar is losing its purchasing power. So why would you want to buy something that's losing its purchasing power? That is, the irony of the foreign exchange market. That's how they work now. It doesn't matter about the dollar's purchasing power. What matters is the direction of interest rates, or real rates, or the rates in the U.S. versus the rates someplace else. It was all a function of rates. That's how the traders had programmed, the algorithms. And so as the Fed was fighting inflation, the dollar was going up. But it was the strength of the dollar that was actually doing the Fed's work, because it was the strong dollar that brought down commodity prices, that brought down oil prices. That's what brought down the headline CPI. So the gains that have been made with respect to measuring inflation have been because of the strong dollar. But here's the problem. The minute the Fed claims victory, or even the markets think that the Fed is winning, even before the Fed actually declares mission accomplished, the markets start trading down the dollar. The dollar starts to fall. And as long as the markets think the Fed is winning, the dollar will keep falling. It was when they thought the Fed was losing that they wanted to buy dollars, because that meant the Fed was going to fight harder and have to raise rates. But if the fight is over and the Fed has won, well, then there's no more rate hikes. And the next thing that's going to happen, if the Fed's not hiking, well, then they're going to cut. And then the dollar's going to get killed. And in fact, if the Fed ever came out and ratified what the markets are thinking and actually said mission accomplished, we're done, we now have a bias towards easing, the dollar's going to fall through the floor. The irony of that is now commodity prices are going to take off on the back of a weak dollar. And so now all of the progress that the Fed made that led it to believe it won the inflation war is going to be lost. And it's going to be obvious that maybe they won a small battle, but inflation ends up winning the war. Because the minute, the Fed is winning, they lose, because then the dollar goes down. Because there is no way to win this war. Because the minute they stop fighting, right, inflation strengthens. So a lot of the inflation that was created before 2020, from QE1, QE2, QE3, QE4, all that stuff, we're just catching up to that. I mean, that's got a long way to go to work its way through the system. In particular, the exodus of the world from their dollars. As the world is selling its US dollar denominated debt, which we know is happening, what is going to happen with all that money? It's going to be spent on goods in the United States, because if our trading partners don't want to save their dollars, well, then they're going to spend those dollars. While they were saving those dollars, they weren't bidding up prices. Now, they were bidding up bond prices as they were taking all their trade surpluses and buying treasuries. They were pushing up bond prices. But now that they're selling those treasuries and pushing down bond prices, they have dollars. What do they do with those dollars? They spend them. Where do you spend dollars? In America. So all the dollars that we shipped abroad now come back, and they bid up domestic prices, and that's going to reflect in the CPI. Let's say you were spending, $2,000 a year on entertainment. You might say, look, I got to cut that back. I'm going to spend $1,000. I'm going to cut my spending in half, right? That would be a spending cut, right? You're in trouble. You're spending too much money, and so you spend less. This is how Washington defines a spending cut. Let's say Washington, Mr. Washington had a family, or he was spending $2,000 on entertainment, and he had to tighten up his belt. He said, I was planning on spending $2,200 on entertainment next year, so I'm going to cut it back, and I'm only going to spend $2,100, and that's a $100 cut, right? Which, of course, it's not a cut. It's still an increase. So, and even the cut itself was tiny, but if you simply reduce the extra spending that you were planning on. You can't call that a cut. I mean, that wouldn't work in the real world with your creditors who are telling you, look, you got to cut back on your spending, and all you're doing is reducing the planned increase in your spending. But we're not even getting that. They're not even talking about doing that. They want to preserve all the spending that they currently have planned without reducing any of the increases, despite the fact that we're trillions and trillions in debt on these deficits. And we can't even have small cuts at this point. When you're running $2, $3, $4 trillion a year deficits, even actual cuts of 100 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion, 500 billion are too little too late. We need substantive cuts across the board. Entire agencies and departments need to be eliminated to get decent savings. We got to cut entitlements. Now, people who are getting these checks have got to get smaller checks.
And here's how Samuel Adams put it in an essay as Candidus in the Boston Gazette. This is where the Sons of Liberty generally published. This is October 1771. He said, "The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. In order to have freedom," Samuel Adams tells us, "we need a 1-2 punch. We need people who value freedom. That means they have to understand it. And then they also have to defend it. They also have to know what needs to be done as well. And that is quite a bit of education. And that means for me, the first thing we have to get to is education. It's pretty hard to value freedom and then defend it if you don't even first know what it is and what it's all about. And when we live in the system that we have today, we are propagandized from cradle to grave, basically, not always intentionally by the people who love us because they just want us to get a good education. They thought things were good when we were kids. And unfortunately, the state-run system, even many of the private institutions for children, because they still have to have approval and accreditation through the same system, is teaching people that the solution to our problems is government. Now, in some situations, you don't get it as bad as I did. I mean, my parents, I don't think would ever have called themselves socialists. In fact, they thought it was evil to be socialist. So I was taught that. But at the same time, almost every scenario, my instinct was, and I believe this is because I went through this government-run and government-approved system in a very socialist area in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that I would basically thought every time there was a problem, government had to come in and fix it, not freedom. Government was never the problem. I even remember the bailouts, not the more recent ones of the people, and then the stimulus checks, or the ones before that of banks. But I remember sometime in the 80s when I was a kid, there were bailouts of airlines. And my first instinct was, well, if the government's paying for it, shouldn't the government just run this? That's because I had no concept, no understanding of what freedom was all about. Benjamin Rush put it this way in 1786, "Freedom can only exist in the society of knowledge. Without learning, men are incapable of knowing their rights." And I certainly did not learn about freedom. I may have learned some history, but it was primarily dates and battles and wars and things like that, never about the foundational principles of liberty. Benjamin Rush was absolutely correct. You can't have freedom without knowledge. And that's the same thing that Thomas Jefferson said in a letter to Charles Yancey in 1816. He said, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." And that brings me to number 2. So on the other hand, it's also pretty hard to value freedom and defend it if you are living in fear, which is a position of weakness. So as long as you're in a position of weakness, well, that's how Jefferson put it, at least. Knowledge is power and ignorance is weakness. So if you're living in fear and you put a higher value on the notion that more government is needed to alleviate your fear, you're going to end up with all kinds of loss of liberty. And we've all heard that famous quote from Benjamin Franklin. The original was in 1755. "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." They don't deserve either, and they certainly are going to get neither. But Benjamin Franklin was far from alone in this mentality. Here's James Madison in the run-up to the Alien and Sedition Acts. In 1798, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he said, "Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad." This is James Madison, the father of the Constitution, recognizing that people will run to government, give up their liberty at home because they're afraid of some foreign danger. And sometimes that foreign danger isn't even real. So Madison is maybe wearing a little bit of a tinfoil hat, and that's what they would tell us today. Oh, fake danger from abroad. Well, you're a conspiracy theorist. No, because the only way we can be truly safe is when we're free. And part of our freedom, of course, is our natural right of self-defense, which is not being exercised even close to the way the founders understood it. So James Madison understood that people gave into fear to give up their liberty. John Adams made the same kind of a point in April of 1776, back when he was one of the good guys, in Thoughts on Government. Fear is the foundation of most governments. You know, if you've heard me talk about this quote before, I always just want to remove the word most. Fear is the foundation of governments. Because certainly if you think about anything, really, you don't just say most, because any government that exists, you're saying, well, we have to do this in order for this reason, because without it, we're going to have this negative result. That is some level of fear, whether rational or irrational. And of course, the crazy increases of power, things like, I don't know, the income tax, the Patriot Act, the National Bank, and things like that, that certainly is a heightened state of fear where people run to government and authorize them more power, and they never, ever give it back. On what I think is number 3, and that is responsibility. And many people don't want to take responsibility for where we are today, the largest government in history. They want to blame a document, for example, saying that the Constitution caused what we have, as if words on paper can cause a government. And of course, if you have bad words on paper that tells the government they can do whatever they want in all cases whatsoever, it's going to do that. But if the people are ignorant of what the text actually means and what it limits, then it's very easy for people to fall in the trap to say, well, the Constitution is bad, the Bill of Rights is a failure, it caused this problem, it's not protecting you, as if you can wrap yourself in a parchment barrier, as James Madison called it, and protect yourself from the most powerful government in history. Here's how Roger Sherman put it in 1787, pointing out that the Anti-Federalists who were making the case for a Bill of Rights, he's like, this isn't really the end of the story. I mean, let's say we get a Bill of Rights. What's that going to do? And here's how he put it. No Bill of Rights ever yet bound the supreme power longer than the honeymoon of a new married couple, unless the rulers were interested in preserving the rights. So of course it's important to list these types of things out, to spell out restrictions, but if you're counting on the words on paper to defend themselves, to limit government, to stop people with guns from doing what they're going to do, then you shouldn't be surprised when they break the rules almost constantly. So we have to have more responsibility for our own freedom.
We can finish it here. U.S. Senator challenges Teamsters president to fight during congressional hearing. Now, Jimmy Hoffa, if he were there, he probably would have just had the guy knocked off, right?
Yeah.
But let's watch. We have a clip of that. I cut out the first part. I just want to cut to the chase, cut to the action. But let's show. This is where a member of the United States Senate, Senator Mullen from Oklahoma, challenges head Teamster. Might want to your phone. Challenges him to a fight, and you can't help but laugh a little. Let's listen to this.
So this is a time, this is a place. You want to run your mouth? We can be two consenting adults. We can finish it here. Okay, that's fine. Perfect. You want to do it now? I'd love to do it right now. Stand your butt up then. You stand your butt up. Oh, hold it. Oh, stop it. Is that your solution over the phone? No, sit down. Sit down. Okay. You're a United States Senator. Sit down. Okay. Sit down, please. All right. Can I respond? Hold it. If we can't, no, I have the button. I'm sorry. This is what he said. You'll have your time. Okay. Can I respond? Oh, no, you can't. This is a hearing.
Well, it's pretty amazing that this can occur, and when you try to figure out how significant is it? Was there really any big difference about philosophy? Probably not. Well, one's conservative, one's liberal, and one believes in power unions and that sort of thing. But it's still, in their own way, they all believe in the government doing more, than they should be doing. And then you end up, how many people in that audience and how many people in the Congress really are worried about a deficit, which may be a real calamity. We might even have some difficulties in the street. We may have riots and people living in the streets and suffering from this bankruptcy.
If you go to the next clip, our second story, Nikki Haley is an unserious candidate in an unserious country. And this is from Zero Hedge. Nikki Haley takes fire over unconstitutional plan to force all social media users to be verified by name. And let's listen to Nikki explain it in her own words.
When I get into office, the first thing we have to do, social media accounts, social media companies, they have to show America their algorithms. Let us see why they're pushing what they're pushing. The second thing is every person on social media should be verified by their name. That's, first of all, it's a national security threat. When you do that, all of a sudden people have to stand by what they say, and it gets rid of the Russian bots, the Iranian bots, and the Chinese bots. And then you're going to get some civility. When people know their name is next to what they say, and they know their pastor and their family members going to see it, it's going to help our kids and it's going to help our country.
Sounds like a little intervention that we wouldn't be endorsing. What's so bad about this is she identified some people who are annoying to us, and that's the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and North Korea, but not in the context of our interventionist foreign policy and our empire and our dealing with sanctions, the more complicated thing, because, they're acting out in their defense, but she doesn't say that. So what she wants to do that's what she's justifying under the Constitution to protect freedom of speech. But what she doesn't want to do is point out who's really violating our freedom of speech, and that's our government. She never once. I mean, if she said, "Well, this is all justified because it's for national security stake." If our national security depends on this and allowing our own government and our FBI doing what they're doing, believe me, she's upside down on this, and I'll tell you, she's not going. I think I will state very plainly that if she's the nominee, I'm not going to vote for her.
This is someone I think you recognize, but this is a great 44 seconds. Listen to what Senator Paul has to say.
And our bill would basically make it illegal for the FBI or Department of Homeland Security or the White House or the CDC. It would be illegal for them to meet with anybody in the media, not just internet companies, but anybody in the legacy media as well, or the print media. It would be illegal, and they would be fired if they were found to be meeting to discuss, cajole, compel, coerce, any kind of discussion to limit constitutionally protected speech. And we decided to use the wording constitutionally protected speech because the FBI pushes back and says, well, we talked to them about taking down child pornography. Well, that's against the law, child pornography. It's not constitutionally protected speech. So it's a good way of trying to divide out what the government can and cannot do.
That's pretty good, new law. It's illegal.
I agreed with that.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Illegal to meet to talk about how to suppress Americans' First Amendment rights. So hats off again to Senator Paul for a great move.
Yeah, well, I want to read a little bit about the article on Taibbi. And this is about how to pick and choose and what to do. And he says, what you're about to read is correspondence between British political operatives and discuss how to use fake news to destroy opponents while hiding behind a disguise as an operation supposedly fighting fake news. These tactics stand out, and this is what they do. Accusations of bigotry and homophobia. Guilt, you're guilty of that. Used to silence political opponents on the group's left. This is pragmatism for the evil people. Use of guilt by association, narratives to attack the reputations of conservatives and leftists. That bipartisan type thing, that generally doesn't stand up quite like that, but it's true, because both sides are doing it. But this way, both sides are doing the bad stuff. Close coordination with dependably incurious mainstream media organization. There's the strategy, and people should be able to draw a better line between when it's good to protect speech and when you have to say there's a limit, and the limit is when the government gets involved and they use it against the people's liberties and against the people's right of free speech. They twist it, they turn it upside down, and generally get away with it.
As Plato proceeds to subdivide the lower emotional element itself into two parts, ending up with 3, 2 plus 1, you see. The lowest element of the low part he calls the appetites. And those are the desires grossly, crudely tied to the physical world. The desires for physical things like food, shelter, wealth, money, sex. Then there is the higher part of the lower part, if you follow that. And it's more or less intermediate. He calls it the spirited element, T-E-D, not the spiritual, because they're all spiritual in the sense of versus physical, but the spirited element. And it is, in effect, the passional, more violent part of your emotional life. The part that is a little higher than the appetites, quite a bit higher than the appetites, because it's not directly tied to physical things, but it's still oriented to this world, so of course it's nothing like the high part. It's responsible essentially for intense anger, indignation, ambition, hatred, the desire for power, honor, glory. Now, if you ask why he made this latter subdivision between the appetites and the spirited, it is the same argument from conflict. He observed that a man's sexual desire can point in one direction, and a man can feel violent anger at his own sexual desire, in which case his indignation, his spirited element, is aligning itself with his reason, let us say, and both of them are against his appetite. On the other hand, the spirited can jump in the other direction. It's, let us speak, called the balance of power in the soul. And if the voice of reason says you shouldn't have that particular desire, and the spirited element chimes in with hatred for reason, and lends its weight to the appetites on top of it, well, then the man is pretty much cooked, you see. So the spirited is like an intermediary part that can go either way. Now you see here the obvious influence of Pythagoras. Remember the 3 men at the Olympic Games, the lover of gain, the lover of glory and fame, and the spectator. Well, that has now been blown up, you see, into a full-fledged theory of human psychology. Plato's own analogy is that inside the skin of every man there are 3 creatures. A little man, and that represents the reason. A raging lion, and that represents the spirited. And a many-headed, slobbering, drooling beast. And that represents the appetites. Now, those of you familiar with Freud will see that there is a close correlation between Plato's trichotomy here and Freud's. At least the id of Freud is simply Plato's appetites put into Latin. And Plato himself took the view that the appetites contain, among their other parts, such evil desires that they come out only in dreams, that we can't face them in real life. Now, I hasten to add, in defense of Plato, that Freud is a 19th century irrationalist, and that by comparison, Plato's trichotomy is a paragon of virtue in relation to the Freudian corruption. If you're interested to know why I say that, I'll discuss that in the question period if you want. The upshot in any event is that for Plato, there is a tripartite soul, three-part, three autonomous, separate, distinctive, independent sources of behavior, three springs of action in man, so that man is inherently, metaphysically, by nature in conflict. His parts are inherently at war with one another. That's human nature. That is not neurosis. Now, it is this psychological theory that sets the problem of ethics. And the problem is, in effect, how to achieve peace and harmony among these parts. Health of the soul for Plato will equal, in effect, peaceful coexistence among the man, the lion, and the many-headed beast. Ethics is the science that's going to tell us how to do it.
As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So a new poll from Reuters Ipsos found that the majority of Americans support the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza, and this is a position that has been rejected by the Biden administration. So about 68% of respondents agreed with the statement that Israel should call for a ceasefire and try to negotiate. So 68%, that's pretty significant. And that includes 3/4 of the Democrats who were polled and about half of the Republicans. So this poll is the second in recent weeks to show that the majority of Americans support a Gaza ceasefire. There was a poll published by Data for Progress on October 20th that found 66% of respondents agreed with the idea of the U.S. calling for a ceasefire and using its leverage to prevent further violence. I kind of thought that poll might have been too good to be true. It said about 80% of Democrats like this idea, but here we have a second poll showing very similar numbers. So this goes to show that how much the Biden administration's support, full-throated support for this war in Gaza, is just not popular. And the Biden administration has called for pauses in the fighting, but they have refused to use the term ceasefire, as it is, the U.S. is very determined to continue supporting Israel's war in Gaza. So my very pessimistic, predictions about their summit yesterday wasn't exactly right. It seems like they did come to some agreements, which is good, but we'll see how this materializes, because sometimes they say that they're going to do things that they don't actually do. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and this is another thing that's been developing pretty late on Wednesday, so I just ran their article about it. So Beijing and Washington agreed to work together on narcotics control and artificial intelligence and resume military-to-military communication, Beijing said, summing up long-awaited talks on Wednesday between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. So this was, the Chinese side is saying this, that they reached these agreements. And in a readout shortly after their 2-hour meeting and a follow-on working lunch held at a secluded estate just south of San Francisco, China called for cooperation and mutual respect, appearing to signal a hoped-for reset after a prolonged downward spiral in relations. But Beijing also underscored that its concerns, especially regarding Taiwan, must be respected. So this readout said, quote, China has interests that must be safeguarded, principles that must be defended, and bottom lines that must be adhered to, end quote. Noted that Taiwan is the most important and sensitive issue in bilateral relations. Xi said that Washington should live up to its pledge and not support Taiwan's independence in concrete actions, and that the U.S. should stop arming the island. Xi punctuated this in talks with Biden by calling on the U.S. to support China's peaceful reunification, according to the readout released by Chinese state broadcaster CCTV. He said what Chinese leaders often say is that China will eventually be reunified and will inevitably be reunified. So there's a few things I want to scroll down a bit. So Biden said some things about, the talking, how important the dialogue is, and this was part of the opening remarks that were publicized. And she said some interesting things, kind of about the U.S.-China relationship taking a, friendly tone. But he's talking about actions that the U.S. has taken against China, the export controls. China's really not happy about the sanctions that Biden has been imposing. He's really ramped up what was the trade war that started under Trump with the tariffs, and Biden has expanded that into these very stringent export controls targeting China's semiconductor industry. So she said that these steps, quote, have seriously damaged China's legitimate interests, suppressing China's science and technology to curb China's high-quality development and deprive the Chinese people of their right to development, end quote. So one thing that's a big deal about these export controls that I always try to mention is that it's not just the U.S. doing it. They've also convinced the Netherlands and Japan to who they export technology needed to make advanced microchips, semiconductors. So the U.S. is also, pressuring other countries to impose these restrictions on China. You put the shoe on the other foot. So another quote here from Xi. He said, quote, "The China-U.S. relationship, which is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, should be perceived and envisioned in a broad context of the accelerating global transformation unseen in a century. Conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides. I'm still of the view that major country competition is not the prevailing trend of current times and cannot solve the problems facing China and the United States or the world at large," end quote. So this is an article from Ken Silva at the Libertarian Institute. So in August 2022, the Justice Department announced that the FBI had foiled an Iranian plot to assassinate former National Security Advisor John Bolton in retaliation for the U.S. killing Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. But the hitman hired to target Bolton was an FBI informant. How lucky was John Bolton? And this was reported on Sunday night by 60 Minutes, which glossed over the fact and treated the Bolton assassination plot as legitimate. So the news report actually did say, lucky for Bolton, the assassin was an FBI informant. And they painted the assassination plot as a legitimate threat. However, DOJ charging papers show that the plot was largely contrived and that Bolton was never in actual danger. Moreover, the DOJ had claimed the man who tried hiring the FBI informant was a member of Iran's IRGC, but charging papers show that investigators never actually confirmed this fact.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And whatever happened to freedom of speech is the title. And they've been robbing it from us day after day after day. And again, this is nothing new. I mean, this has been going on. I remember you telling me about, and all the people listening, about what that slime ball who should rot in hell, Woodrow Wilson, who gave us World War I to help slaughter more people, and gave us the Federal Reserve and gave us federal income tax and the IRS. And he sent my kids to jail for reading the, what was it?
So he before he was president, was governor of New Jersey for just 18 months. And before that was the president of Princeton University for 10 years. And before that was a professor of constitutional law at Princeton. He arrested, as president of the United States, Princeton students who stood in front of a draft office in Trenton, New Jersey, and read aloud, not Karl Marx, but the Declaration of Independence. And for that, they were arrested because he felt that reading the Declaration of Independence interfered with the war by discouraging people from registering for the draft. When challenged by the press, what about the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. He said it only restrains Congress. It doesn't restrain the president.
It doesn't. No, go on. I'm sorry.
Such an answer in a law school exam today would cause you to flunk the exam. But that's what this professor of constitutional law argued once he became president. He knew damn well that only Congress can write the laws. He knew damn well that the First Amendment restrained Congress, the president, and the judiciary. Today, fortunately, it restrains all of the government. But it's just an example of how differently people view the government from the outside in when he was a professor of constitutional law, as opposed to from the inside out when he's the president of the United States. That's just one example of suppression of speech, the glaring one. By the way, the name of the federal agent that he sent to, he wasn't there personally to arrest them. The name of the federal agent he sent to arrest them, 24-year-old John Edgar Hoover. You can't make this stuff up, Gerald.
Another slime ball.
Well, that was the beginning of Hoover's ascendancy and the creation of the FBI. Of course, Hoover relished the idea of arresting these waspy, privileged Princeton kids that had the nerve to recite Jefferson outside of a draft office. Now, fast forward to today. A liberal Democrat with whom I agree on nothing, former New Jersey state senator, went to the Philadelphia Eagles football game 2 Sundays ago and had a flag. And on the flag, it had a banner, and on the banner was an American flag and an Israeli flag. He's got his own views about the United States and Israel. An hour later, he was escorted out of that stadium by the police. Now, the stadium is owned by the government. The government cannot prohibit speech on its own property. The government can't prohibit speech anywhere. And yet this stuff just keeps happening over and over again. On college campuses not far from where I live, the pro-Palestinian demonstrators want the police to silence the pro-Israeli demonstrators. The pro-Israeli demonstrators want the pro-Palestinian demonstrators silence. You and I have very, very strong views on this. We are decidedly on the side of the Palestinian people. But the government has no right suppressing anybody's speech. Congress shall make no law means you can say whatever you want. How can you be happy? How can you pursue happiness if you can't think as you wish and say what you think and offer publicly what you say? That's why I wrote the column. These are perilous times for the freedom of speech.
Let's talk about censorship. Let's go back to the COVID war. If you don't swallow the crap spewing out of the mouth of a clown that plays governor, president, mayor, or whatever, you have no right. You have to swallow their crap and do what you're told, or else you're censored. And if you believe anything else, then you believe in misinformation. I mean, it's right in front of our eyes. We've lost our freedom.
We are losing freedom, no question about it. That nut job, Nikki Haley, who wants to bomb Tehran, last night said that if she becomes president, again, she thinks she can write laws. She'll sign an executive order ordering the social media companies to fork over their algorithms because she wants to know who is writing under anonymous names. Was she out of her mind? The Federalist Papers themselves were written under anonymous names. The First Amendment stands for the right to speak under an anonymous name. The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the government out of the business of speech. What business is it of the President of the United States or anybody in any government what the real name of the speaker is? If you don't like the speech, don't listen to it or challenge it, but don't try to silence it. This lady is running for President of the United States. She's leading the pack after Donald Trump. The billionaires that hate and fear Trump are now going to her. She's a maniac.
I know.
Scott Ritter said the other day, don't vote for Nikki Haley if you expect to see your grandchildren alive. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, she wants to start a war with Iran. She wants a draft. She wants to take young people and have them slaughtered in the deserts of Iran. Is that what the American public wants? Ritter's right.
Judge, we're in a very, very dangerous time right now. And you could see that if anybody could see what's going on in Gaza with the slaughter of thousands of people, tens of thousands, over 10,000, somewhat 30,000 seriously wounded, over 11,000 dead, mostly women and children.
Oh, Tony Blinken says, well, we'll get them to drop smaller bombs.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
No more being anonymous online. If what we need is everybody, when they log into their phone and they interact digitally, we know exactly who you are. And we're not just talking about the way that the NSA gathers all the information and, you know, the way that big data is collected on you all the time. No, we need this to be a more public record so we don't have to pretend like we got to look through these secret channels and corridors and open up cases and get warrants for all the information that we already had collected on you anyways. No, what we need is that if anyone's going to be on the internet, well, then we know exactly who you are at all times. No more anonymous posting. And on that note, you know, any social media platform, they could sell themselves as the no anonymous post platforms. I believe with Facebook, didn't you have to actually validate yourself? And I guess Facebook, if they wanted to, if it was better for their business, they could force validations. I could even see why some people might prefer a social media environment where people are validated. But leave that to the companies. When suddenly, you know, the government's getting involved, doesn't that just sound like, and we also had that statement from Katie Hochul or whatever it was. It's always for our benefit. There's always, because of the dangers that might exist online, we have to start tracking everyone's behavior on social media because if not, their evil statements might lead to this, which might lead to that, which is why we have to start restricting your freedoms immediately for your own benefit. And we all know what's going on here. They want to know who's dissenting. They want to know who they got to censor. Any one of these people that's not pro free speech is not pro, hey, we got to make sure that everyone's got a voice, everyone can interact, everyone can have their freedom, and they can be tracked even less. Any statement like this that you hear, which is something more about removing your ability to be anonymous on the internet and for government to track you, just know what people are up to.
When I get...
All right, next topic. Oh, dude. You know how sometimes I say on this show that I'm just pulling information out of my ass, but it's unbelievable how accurate the information up my rectum is? I swear, I think my rectum might be manifesting the news at this point because I saw the headline about how the House passes measures to avert a shutdown, how the Democrats and the Republicans came together, all the Republicans that tried to boot McCarthy because he was doing nothing to reduce the budget. Their votes didn't even matter on this one because the Democrats were happy enough to work together with that Republican contingency that's also just willing to overlook debt and pretend like they're making minor adjustments and that Israel and whatever war machine and other people are getting their resources. And usually, oh, we pretend like we're going to have a problem with this till the very deadline. And when I saw that instantly these two sides came together, I was like, yeah, because it's Thanksgiving. These people don't want to have to pretend like they're not going home for Thanksgiving. They don't want budget things on their mind. You got to leave that for when it's not pre-vacation. Because they're exactly like you and I when we had college papers. They wait for the last second, they wait for the deadline, then they just go, fuck it, we don't have a solution. Sure, just send everybody the money, print more checks, watch some more things, make sure people have their earmarks, and they give up. But when I saw that they were able to get this done within like 10, you're like, oh yeah, because it's Thanksgiving. They don't want these things on their mind. And I was just like intuitively, I just knew. I was like, yeah, this is clearly a Thanksgiving thing. I wouldn't think that these people would be so open to just report back to us, yes, if there's things that we want to do in our lives, and it doesn't matter how important the task is, such as the country going bankrupt, if it's actually family time and family vacation, we're not going to look into what's bankrupting us. And that was just me. I saw the headline. I was like, this is clearly they want to get home for Thanksgiving, right out of the Wall Street Journal. The bill's passage showed many lawmakers had little appetite for brinkmanship just ahead of their Thanksgiving break, opting for a clean measure that extends funding at current levels but pushes off fights over issues including border security, federal spending levels, and Ukraine funding just ahead of the vote. House Democrats leaders threw their support behind the bill, saying in a statement that it avoided harmful cuts and extreme right-wing policy riders. There you go. They just went, you know what? I'm hungry for some turkey. Fuck it. Everyone game to take the month off and resume not solving these things next month. All hands say yay. This I might have even mentioned on the show. When I look at my coverage of the Ukraine and Russia war, I go, it was obvious that Russia was going to react in this way. You guys repeatedly said that you refused to not move the NATO border all the way up to their doorstep. He was saying that this was a red line. And so you guys you provoked the bear. And it's not an endorsement of anything that Putin was doing, but, your continuous need to fight with Putin and your, not wanting to negotiate. I was like, this is all kind of natural outcome. And in a lot of respects, I was even faulting the United States government in that they weren't trying to negotiate, even placate Putin in a way, and that we were sending money over there that was just going to lead to more Ukrainian deaths. Now, you could look at all that, everything that we were saying about the Ukraine situation, and going, yeah, but where's all the yelling and hollering about the Putins and all of the civilian deaths that took place in all those battles? And you want to know something? I don't think I said anything about anything that Putin was doing. We said that it was, not cool. We're not endorsing it. But I don't think we did a lot of coverage over bombed buildings inside of Ukraine or civilian casualties. And I think when we were looking at the civilian casualties, I was going, this is why we shouldn't be involved and this is why we shouldn't be sending funds, because otherwise this could de-escalate. Now, are these directly comparable to the Israel situation? No, not at all. I think what I'm trying to point out, though, is that one of the things that's been a little bit unfair of some of even my own coverage of the Israel stuff, and I've already pointed this out on the show, is that I don't know the numbers on every human catastrophe that happens across the globe, and that doesn't mean that I don't know, this is where you start playing the internet game, where you're like, I don't want to come out as pro-death. You got to start every statement with, I love babies, and I don't think any baby should die, unless you're into abortions and you don't consider that a baby, in which case I'm on your side too. Hey, listen, I just want to be the nicest of everybody and make sure that I'm making the right placating statements at all time. Just if it wasn't already clear that I wasn't into death, and I'd like everyone to be able to live a nice life with their kids and with happiness and a smile on their face at all times. It's like, you really got to make sure at all part, like, hey, I'm really making sure that I'm making all the proper placations at the beginning of this thing so no one tries to spin this and go, hey, you really love death and want to kill babies. All right.
The right is now pro-censorship when it comes to the Middle Eastern war. We know that the left are pro-censorship because of the last 3 years of COVID and Ukraine censorship. So, does either party believe in free speech anymore? After 9/11, the FBI abused its powers and entrapped Muslims. After Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the rounding up of Japanese Americans. These are moral stains on our history. Keeping military secrets is one thing. Demanding censorship of even ugly, awful, and offensive speech is another. People are saying revolting things. They must remain free to do so, not just because the First Amendment requires it, but also because talking back to hatred is ultimately the only way to overcome it. And while the suppression of free expression always starts with the least popular speech, it never ends there. Yes, it does seem, just on my experience in the last few years, that certain figures were taken out of the culture, but over time that has escalated to include more people and more ideas, and it's been a kind of expanding remit of ideas and speech and individuals that can be censored and shut down. Have you noticed that yourself? And in a way, even though free speech necessarily means hearing speech you don't agree with, that's an easier sacrifice to make than its alternative, the ongoing ongoing implementation of ever-increasing censorship, particularly when you suspect from movements of power elsewhere in the world that there's a desire to centralise authority. I'm talking about legislation for censorship, online safety bills, the bill in Canada, the bill in Ireland, EU's proposals, the introduction of CBDCs that primarily seem to be beneficial because they can be controlled and shut down. I suppose, taken in context with the apparent agenda to increase authoritarianism, this increase in censorship via challenging free speech on the basis of hate speech is a trend that has to be observed. And I suppose it's surprising, isn't it, that people that had built their career around it, or people that were determined that free speech was everything, suddenly abandoning it. That's curious, isn't it? A month ago, France banned all pro-Palestinian demonstrations in the country. On the same day, Germany banned a pro-Palestinian protest group. In the UK, the Home Secretary instructed police to consider taking unspecified measures against such actions as chanting slogans and waving a Palestinian flag. In the United States, such measures would clearly violate the Constitution. Such state suppression of political speech is anathema to American values. But in the United States too, our commitment to free speech is being tested. Within hours of the attacks, a number of Harvard student groups signed a letter placing blame for all violence in the region on Israel alone. The apartheid regime is the only one to blame, it read. Bill Ackman, a billionaire hedge fund manager, demanded that Harvard release the names of all the student members of those groups so that he could compile a hiring blacklist for his CEO friends. Someone on Twitter compiled such a list himself, called the Terror List. Later, a truck began circling the Harvard campus with digital billboards displaying the names and faces of students alleged to have signed the statement under the title Harvard's Leading Anti-Semites. Websites popped up listing student members' names, pictures, social media profiles, class years, hometowns, and former employers. Republican Senator Josh Hawley said he hoped the Department of Justice was investigating pro-Palestinian student groups like the ones at Harvard. The Harvard students weren't the only ones who faced real-world retaliation for their views. An NYU law school student saw a job offer rescinded for expressing a sentiment similar to the one in the Harvard student group letter. NYU's Student Bar Association voted to remove the student as president. The Philly Voice fired a sports writer for tweeting solidarity with Palestine always. Do you recall at the beginning of the ascent of Jordan Peterson that he said, what's happening on campuses now will spread to the culture and you'll start to see this tendency towards cancellation and enforced speech and prohibition of speech. And it was obviously, you all know how Jordan Peterson is regarded in the culture. Some of you now, because of Jordan Peterson's position on this war, might have changed your perspective on him. But I feel the principle that Jordan Peterson was talking about was essentially free speech and refusing coercive speech. Now we're in a position where we're sort of normalizing cancellation. We're normalizing actions that don't seem to have due process behind them at all. It's just like these people signed this list. I don't know. Wouldn't you be happy to be friends with someone who is pro-Palestine or someone that's pro-Israel? Is that for you a line? I mean, I noticed that this got exacerbated in Trump. It was like a kind of joke thing. Oh, what to do with your relatives that are pro-Trump at Christmas? And already for someone my age, that was an exaggeration and an amplification of the ordinary tensions that were in any family. That any family would have people that were a bit conservative and some that were socialist, unless you're in a very particular community where everyone's a docker or works at a coal mine or something, then you live in a very sort of insular, tribalised community. But it was accepted that we didn't need to be so opposed to one another that we wanted the government to step in and censor speech on our behalf. Like when you show your kid a movie and it's like, oh, this is meant to be a PG movie or a 12 movie, and you think, well, this movie, I'm thinking it's particularly of Little Shop of Horrors, shouldn't be a PG movie, it's too crazy. But then I think, well, I am still in charge. I can just stop my kid watching this movie if I want to. We have power at the level of the individual. We have power at the level of the community. I wonder what is lost by empowering the state and other agencies to shut down, in particular, free speech on our behalf, just because in this instance we happen to agree with it. There's certainly been a lot of things said about me lately that I wish had been shut down, let me tell you, but hey, free speech. All of this is legal in the United States. Much of it is protected speech, but it's hard to deny, at least without moving goalposts, that the backlash is as clear an example as one can find of cancel culture. The purpose of exposing and punishing each of them personally is the same as when left-wing activists dox and shame their enemies to make anyone who thinks of voicing even moderate dissent, such as criticising the scale or conduct of Israel's military response, think twice lest they be punished too. Meanwhile, the same publications that have dismissed and denied the reality of government-funded, government-demanded and government-coerced censorship are raising the alarm about widespread censorship of progressive voices on social media platforms. In the face of the horrors that have occurred and those to come, we must not lose our humanity and our principles. It's possible for every one of us to have compassion for innocent people on all sides. It's also possible for every one of us to defend free speech for the views we most abhor. In so doing, we care more, not less, and keep the possibility of peace and security alive, however remote it may be at the moment. I suppose the abandonment of generally accepted principles at a time of crisis can only exacerbate those sets of crises. It's long been obvious to me that principles and values were being weaponized, used to persecute people, to shut down debate, to create conflict. What I suppose we have to look at is how our willingness to put aside our own principles and values when it's convenient to us are likely to affect society as a whole.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
All right, I'm going to try to steel man a position here and see what your response is. So let's say I'm a well-meaning conservative, like not an idiot. I'm not a Mitch McConnell guy. I more or less see the world clearly, but I've got some blind spots. And I approach you, Clint Russell, and I say, you and I have a lot in common, and we definitely feel put upon by the same bad guys. And so where possible, we should try to see where we can work together. And this, let's say this person even says, now I will grant you that my Republican Party is still full of Mitt Romney people. It's still full of fund the Ukrainians people, full of these people who are going to have the wrong position on a lot of things, who are going to have the wrong position even on the most obvious things. We have people who are going to stab you in the back all day long, but we still do have a rising group that nevertheless is a bunch of dissenters from this. We do have some, we have an increasing constituency of people who are starting to see the world more clearly. Now, they're not great on everything. They're going to be China war hawks, just even though they're good on other things, they won't be good on this. But I think some of the party is moving in the right direction. And this is a time when we can't afford to indulge in this vanity project of voting for some ideologically pure libertarian candidate when the future of our kids' souls hangs in the balance. So can't you just drop this vanity project and try and work with the best people we have in the Republican Party to try to salvage something?
Yeah, I honestly, it's a fair argument to make. I don't think it's an unfair one, but the truth is that just as in, you know, a free market, without competition, your quality of service declines and the cost of it increases. I mean, that's just what happens. It's monopoly practices. Basically, for the liberty-minded amongst us in America, the GOP has a monopoly on voting for freedom, and they don't deliver freedom. It's a terrible product. So I want to have more competitors that I can actually send my dollars to and receive some of my liberty. So, you know, this is the primary argument that I have for why it's important that there is more than a GOP option for, you know, peace and freedom. And because the truth is, GOP doesn't deliver that. They deliver record, budget deficits, and they also deliver, as many wars as the Democrats do historically, it seems. So, I think that's well, I do understand the argument. I think that it's flawed because if you don't hold their feet to the fire, they're not going to do a damn thing for you. Let me also say, if it's Gavin Newsom, I as a California refugee, I am so mortified at that guy having a shot at ruling over this nation that I would probably have to actually get out and campaign for Donald Trump. Gavin Newsom is Satan reincarnate. He is one of the worst human beings on the planet, maybe in human history. He is so dangerous. I have to, every time I get an opportunity, to emphasize this to people because I really think he's got a shot at being the next president. You have to do everything in your power to keep him from being the president of the United States. He is so dangerous. He will ruin this country if it's not already ruined. I'm being totally sincere about this.
It's incredible that he could be such an ego case that he could look at the state of California, the condition of this state, and say, I'm going to run on that.
Oh my God. Today he's actually, so over the past 2 weeks, they cleaned up all of the homeless encampments and all of the syringes and everything else from the streets of San Francisco because Xi Jinping was coming to town.
Yeah.
His actual boss was showing up and he's like, we got to clean these streets out. I mean, and then he's asked about it today, and he goes, a lot of people think that we cleaned up these streets because we have foreign dignitaries that are coming to. Yeah, you're right. He says you're right, and he continues on. It's just incredible. I mean, these people, they just don't care at all. But the crazy thing is that they don't have to. They don't have to. There was a recall election, and he won by 70% during the teeth of lockdowns when all of the businesses had been shut down and our lives were utterly ruined. He walked away with a recall election victory. So. Don't underestimate that guy. No matter how transparently evil he is, he's got a shot.
Yeah, anytime any of these people, whether it was Whitmer or anybody else, won re-election, what did that say? That's saying you ruined my life for no good reason, and I approve of that. Or I'm so incurably stupid that I couldn't be bothered even to look up whether this did any good, and I just trust you because you're the person in charge. I mean, I don't know what.
When I look at the polling figures and, people are like, Joe Biden is polling at the lowest percentage, for any president at this point in his presidential, term, whatever. And I always look at it and I'm like, 40% of people approve of this
Yes,
guy?
I know this figure is way too high.
it's like it ought to be 2. How are there 40% of people that think that Biden's doing a good job?
Yeah, or 40% of people who say, this is exactly what I wanted to happen.
Oh my God. It's so crazy. So yeah, I mean, same exact sentiment. I'm trying to decide, is it Cuomo? Is it Whitmer? Is it Newsom, who are the worst governors on earth, certainly in America? And then they go, who are the 3 people that were considering replacing Biden? It's Cuomo, Whitmer, Newsom. What is happening? Why are the worst politicians actually, climbing the ladder when they should be in prison? It's so infuriating. That's the whole argument for, Dave Smith's presidential run that we were all hoping for. It was what those movements create is the next generation of leaders. You don't know it at the time. You don't see it coming. You don't know that the guy who's handing out flyers down at, the ground zero, like Luke Rutkowski, is going to end up, having an audience of hundreds of thousands or millions per month. You just never know. But that's what, lighting that fire in people in their 20s and early 30s can do. It can lead to the next generation of Ron Pauls. So all hope is not lost, folks. Hang in there.
There's been a lot of international excitement going on. The leader of China and the great leader of the United States, they got together and had lunch. They at least considered it. I don't know whether they ever got around to it, but it was to have diplomatic talk and bring the countries together again. They spent a couple days, several millions of dollars getting Biden over there. But it was a 1-minute clip there that made all the news, and that is Biden called Xi the dictator of China, a dictator. And those were fighting words, and that's what they're talking about right now. And I think, well, it probably is. But then I got to thinking, Chris, about the difference. Is there any dictatorship in this country at all? When you think about the control of the FBI with social media and our invasion of our privacy and on, I'm not so sure we're in a position where we can be accusing the Chinese of being the only dictators in the world.
And Xi. He said some things that I wish our own politicians would say. He said, quote, "It's unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has terrible consequences for both sides." He said the world at large is big enough for the two countries to succeed. And he's right. And Xi also said China does not seek spheres of influence and will not fight a Cold War or hot war with anyone. Now, think about that GOP debate. They were all foaming at the mouth, just picking countries to go to war with. And we jump from Ukraine to Israel without pause. We don't even think about anything. We have our Treasury Secretary, who is overseeing a Treasury that is $33 trillion in debt and $1 trillion in interest payments, who says, yeah, we can afford to fight 2 wars. I mean, this is the difference. And the Chinese and the rest of the world are sitting back and watching us bankrupt ourselves voluntarily. And we're sitting here trying to put out the opposite ideas. But when you look at the political atmosphere, they want nothing of it. They want one thing, and that is war. And that will totally finish us financially and economically.
So often, if you take the Chinese bashing, they'll say, well, they did this and this, but they say they have our money and they're buying up stuff and it's China's fault. They're undermining our liberties. But nobody wants to talk about the fact that we've had a reserve currency of the world. We dictate to the world the dollar standard, and it's running out of steam, and we've had that control since 1945, and it's been going on all this time. And so who do you think gave the dollars to China? We did. We buy all their stuff. So we were getting a bargain. We just printed that money, which is a problem coming home to roost. We did that, and we bought up their goods and services. Now communism is still influencing China, and now our system is moving more strongly toward authoritarianism. So in some way you might say there's going to be a collision on who's going to grab up the pieces, because both systems, whether it's avowed communism or the interventionism that we have endorsed and the desire for our empire, they will end. The question is can the people who believe in liberty have enough influence to get people to come in our direction? Because if their minds aren't changed, and I'm not talking about the minds of a couple more congressmen, I'm talking about the minds of the people, and that can happen. We saw a change in attitude during COVID, and fortunately, what we have to concentrate on, and we all must do it, is try to get people to understand there's no free ride. Liberty is something that comes to us, and then you have to work for what you want. Oh, well, we don't know about that. Our country's so wealthy, we can invite everybody in the world to come here because we have wealth forever, all based on a fallacy and illusion of this, deception that all you have to do is print money and you'll have wealth and you'll have the military power that you need. That's where the fallacy is. Chris.
Excellent, Dr. Paul. I'll finish up with my closing thoughts. I really don't have to say this. It's very obvious that we live in very dangerous times. When I look at the presidential candidates from both parties, not very encouraging at all. Sadly, even with President Trump, former President Trump, he goes around saying, I'm the only one that could keep us out of World War III. But remember, Woodrow Wilson said the same thing. FDR said the same thing. They're reelected based on making those promises. But unfortunately, even President Trump intervenes overseas, and that's a big problem. Now, do I think he would start World War with China or Russia? No, I don't. But the Middle East? That's who knows? He hasn't shown us that he would make America great again when it comes to the Middle East. So we're in very, very difficult times because there's no one to turn to. at least in the presidential election. But we don't necessarily need that because it starts with the American people. Excuse me. Politicians reflect the attitudes of the American people, like Dr. Paul says. And the American people, unfortunately, either passively or even aggressively are okay with our foreign policy. And that needs to change. And I think more and more people are, grasping, because we really just move from one country to the next. And it's, it's nonsense. And our standard of living is dropping precipitously. I had friends that are complaining to me that how much they're paying for milk, to feed, they have kids and they're paying, just crazy amounts for milk. That all stems from our empire. That's where it comes from. That's what is draining us. And we've said before, we don't get an invoice in the mailbox. We see it at the supermarket. We see it with our prices that double and triple and quadruple. So we're paying for this. And we need to get to the point where we just have to say enough is enough. A strong minority of people, a critical mass of people need to say, that's it, bring the troops home. And the majority of people will follow because that's human nature. The majority just follows. So it starts with that critical minority. And, hopefully someday we'll see the positive results from good ideas.
How should you live? How will you achieve harmony of the soul and therefore happiness? Well, Plato says the answer lies in the fact that each of these three parts of the soul has a specific function, a specific job to do, a specific purpose to serve in the organism as a whole. And if we grasp the function of each, that will guide us as to how to use each properly. The function of reason is obviously to acquire knowledge of the world of forms, and on the basis of this knowledge to rule the other parts of the personality, and therefore to guide man's life. The spirited and the appetitive element, of course, are blind. They respectively simply roar and drool. It is only reason that can see the consequences of an action, the conditions of a goal that can plan long range, and it must therefore be reason that is ruling. Now, when a man's reason has acquired the knowledge and is ruling his life, the man as a whole, says Plato, has the virtue of wisdom. I might mention here as background that the Greeks recognized 4 cardinal virtues. The conventional Greeks. In the way in which today in a Christian civilization, you say the main virtues are faith, hope, and charity. Well, in Greece, the stand-ins for them, the conventional virtues were wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. It was a better civilization. Well, Plato is going to show how he can accommodate these standard 4 according to his particular scheme. Now, the spirited element, what is its function? Well, essentially, it is the executive element of the personality. It's the part that incites you to action. Plato holds that disembodied reason itself would merely contemplate motionlessly, would never do anything. He says no man would ever act simply out of his theoretical intellectual conclusions. And therefore, in his view, the spirited or passional element is required to get a man moving, doing something on the basis of his rational conclusions. It's the thing that gives you the drive, the energy, the enthusiasm to go out into the world and fight for your values rather than merely sit back and contemplate them. Now, its proper function, of course, is to let itself be guided by reason. So it will act only for values sanctioned by reason and will fight in battles only approved by reason. In other words, it has to align itself on the side of reason. And if so, says Plato, the man as a whole will have the virtue of courage. Now, he calls it courage because he thinks of the spirited element as functioning most obviously in military campaigns. When a soldier is guided by reason, he will know exactly how much to endure, what to fear, and what not to fear. He won't either roar out blindly, taking foolish risks, not knowing what he's doing, or on the other hand, turn yellow and turn tail and run when he should have stood his ground. In such a case, he'll be neither foolhardy nor cowardly, he will be courageous. And thus Plato gets the second virtue, courage. As to the appetitive element, it essentially performs the life-promoting functions. Essentially, it's the concern for food, sex, material, sustenance, physical goods. Now, this is the most dangerous element, because there is a chronic tendency on the part of the beast to spring. There is a chronic temptation to start enjoying these pursuits as pleasures in themselves, rather than merely as a means to promoting life. And therefore, the appetites come to dominate most men. Here again, says Plato, we must be guided by their function. We must never indulge in them as ends in themselves. We must willingly submit to the rule of reason. We must, to use Freudian terms, keep the lid on the id. And if you do this, you have virtue number 3, temperance. Now, temperance as used in Greece does not mean complete abstinence. It doesn't have the same meaning as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. But it's a little closer to that in Plato in particular because he's a Platonist. Now, assume that these 3 parts are acting properly as I've described. Each is doing its job. We have, in effect, a psychological division of labor. Each is doing what it is suited for and not interfering with the others. And the result is we have an integrated, harmonious personality. And then, says Plato, the man as a whole has the virtue of justice. He called it justice because the Greeks tended to think of justice not as one virtue among others, but as a synonym for virtue or good behavior in general. On the other hand, injustice or evil would be a lower part of the personality gaining control, seizing the reins and growing cancerously out of all proportion. So, for instance, Plato would say that Hitler represents a cancer of the spirited element, the power luster, you see. Or that Don Juan represents the cancer of the appetitive element. And I might say Plato would equally say that an industrialist like Henry Ford Sr. represents a cancer of the appetitive element. Virtue, in a word, is cancer of some part of the soul, spiritual, improper growth. And therefore, Plato's final answer to the sophists is, why shouldn't you live this way? The way the sophists say, because you are killing yourself spiritually. You are undermining your soul. You are instituting a civil war which will lead to your destruction. And here you see he has given a fuller account of Socrates' view of the health of the soul. He's now developed that view into a whole theory of what the soul is and what parts it has and therefore how it should live, and he's done it by tying it to a whole overall metaphysical epistemological base. And if you now ask Plato the question with which he began the Republic, if you give a man the ring of Gyges, how should he live? When he can get away with murder if he wants, Plato would say, don't do it. Even if you can get away with it, it isn't worth it because you are obviously destroying yourself in the process. And notice, therefore, that Plato's answer to the sophists amounts to this. We have to turn away from the concerns of life on earth. We have to repress our passions and our appetites and concentrate on another super-reality. The choice these two schools offer you, in effect, is whim-worshipping subjectivism or otherworldly asceticism. And that is the alternative they offer. Plato does not say emotions are consequences of your premises. And if your premises are rational, your emotions will be rational and your personality stable and healthy. He says emotions are absurd, irrational elements waiting to spring up and seize control. And health consists in sitting on them and not letting them get too violent.
What do we have on the casualty numbers out of Gaza so far?
So the numbers coming out, and they have slowly are stopped increasing so quickly in the past week or so, and it is 11,000 civilians total. 4,500 of those deaths are children. I believe the number is 40 journalists and over 100 UN employees, and so that's kind
what
of the
about
breakdown.
fighters?
I haven't seen a number on that. I also haven't seen a number on the total number of Hamas killed on October 7th either.
Yeah. Well, I sure would like to know if they've killed any Hamas guys in all of their bombing of the Gaza Strip. I'm sorry for laughing. It's just the absurdity of that thing. I'm sure somebody must have been engaged at point-blank range there in the fight in North Gaza. But, I mean, in the bombing campaign for all these weeks and weeks and weeks where we all know, we meaning all of humanity on this planet, know that Hamas is buried deep underground, mostly safe from Israeli strikes on the people above. So, I mean, do you have any sense that, well, there's a cover-up? Sometimes they do kill Hamas fighters, but they're just classified as civilians? Or, no, really, nobody's seen any Hamas fighters around here. These are all civilians being, having their corpses pulled out of the rubble here.
Yeah, so a couple weeks ago, the Washington Post, I believe, reported that while Israel had carried out an extensive bombing campaign to Gaza, they hadn't hurt the middle or upper ranks of Hamas. Now, as far as, foot soldiers of Hamas are people in Gaza who are employed by Hamas to do various things, because they are the, as you say, the wardens of the prison, so they do assign other jobs other than military ones. And then one of the things, I guess, on the fighter point, Scott, I think why we probably don't have a number, especially when we're talking about the Israeli forces coming in and engaging with Hamas, is that the 11,000 number that's being counted are bodies that have gone to hospitals in Gaza, morgues in Gaza, or I guess turned up at other like official agencies like UN shelters or something like that, and then were buried. And so if somebody was killed engaging with Israeli forces, their body probably wouldn't have turned up in area that is still populated with Palestinians, and so it's not going to be counted as a part of that 11,000 number. And in fact, the Israeli bombing of and attacks on Palestinian hospitals in Gaza at this point have really slowed the release of these numbers. Communications have almost been completely cut. I believe the guy who is coordinating the number is at the Al-Shifa hospital that's currently besieged by the Israeli forces. And as of today, I believe there's actually Israeli forces on the grounds and in the building of those hospitals and telling the doctors to stay away from the windows or they're going to be shot. So I think it's unlikely we're going to get an update on the death toll in the next couple of days at least.
Yeah. All right. So talk to me about what's happening at the Al-Shifa hospital there in Gaza. Did they find terror tunnels full of weapons?
Not so far, not that I've seen. All the evidence that I've seen put out by Israel, people have used the Google Find Image and have shown that a lot of these are from old pictures from 2012, 2014 in the past when Israel's carried out operations into Gaza. And so nothing to show anything current. It's so hard to get good information and any kind of confirmed information coming out, particularly at the Al-Shifa hospital, because communications have been almost completely cut. Doctors Without Borders will put out a statement every day or two when they get a hold of one of their doctors that's in the hospital, or the UN or another agency will. But that's really all the communications we're getting. And a part of the reason is that people are not being allowed to leave. The doctors are reporting that anybody who's tried to leave, ambulances that have tried to leave and retrieve wounded civilians that are outside of the gates of the hospital have been fired on and killed. So there's no option. And in fact, yesterday, because about 180 bodies are decomposing in the hospital, they had opened up a mass grave on the grounds, and they apparently buried those people last night or today.
I mean, this is why they can bomb these places, is because there are no civilians really, or even if they are civilians, there's always a Hamas terrorist hiding behind them or below them. And of course, it goes without saying then that all those human shields' lives are forfeit, and Israel can kill as many civilians as they want to. And meanwhile, where's Hamas? And, they're always just begging the question and arguing past the sale, whatever. Hey, sometimes civilians get killed, but obviously Israel isn't targeting them. They're just happening to get killed when Israel is only targeting bad guys. But who says so?
Right. And obviously, apply this to any human condition where, say, a bank robber runs into somebody's house. The police don't get to line up a tank and just blow your house away because, a dangerous robber was in there, Scott. So, we had to make sure he didn't get out and kill more people. So we killed all of you.
It's Anti-War Radio. I'm talking with Kyle Anzalone. And let me ask you, Kyle, what is this thing in the Wall Street Journal where they're saying, hey, America, you should take the Gazans so that we can have Gaza? It's unbelievable, man.
Yeah, so 2 members of the Israeli Knesset wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal arguing Western countries should take in refugees from Gaza as Israeli officials to continue to call for Palestinians to be pushed out of the enclave. We've actually had in the past couple of days, I believe, the agricultural minister in Israel call for or say that this campaign was going to be Nakba 2023, which is kind of fascinating because I don't think Israel officially recognizes the Nakba, and you're not supposed to mention it. And of course, that is referring to the 1948 ethnic cleansing of what was then Palestine and moving all the Palestinians to the West Bank or Gaza Strip. So what they're talking about is, finishing that for Gaza and kicking all the Palestinians out there.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And on the market front, not today, the Dow is down a little bit, but things are still pretty positive. Let's see, the 30-day stock index slipped, but Walmart slid 8% after the world's largest retailer issued a lower than expected forecast for the year. The largest retailer. That's how the country's been fucking sold out, man. The bigs own everything because you got a bunch of fucking scumbags, your political leaders who sold this country out. Peru recession deepens as economy shrinks more than forecast. Japan's economy shrank at the fastest annualized quarterly pace in 2 years. You ready? The Japanese yen is at its languishing near its lowest in more than a decade. Danish economy slips into recession. European labor market weakens as economy falters. After a year of near zero economic growth, job creation is slowing, and surveys suggest more businesses are preparing to lay off workers. Every week in your Trends Journal, I think this is the 63rd or 64th week that we've been doing it. We put the amount of layoffs going around the world. I'm mentioning all this because the equity markets are going up. Oh, but oil prices are going down. Danish economy slips into recession. Germany's GDP contracted 0.1%. They're in recession. Japan's economy sank at the fastest annualized quarterly pace in 2 years. Peru. We can keep going on here. So why the equity market's going up? And again, go back to they're going to be lowering interest rates. Germany's unemployment rate climbed by 0.8%, the highest level since 2017. Retail sales declined for the first time in the United States since March. This is important. Burberry shares shrank 9% as luxury spending slowdown bites. We've been reporting week after week after week of the declines from the big luxury brands. Very, very important. So it's not the plantation workers of Slavelandia that can't afford to buy stuff. It's the people with dough that are cutting back too, because they got less dough out there. 80% of American households are in a worse financial position now than they were before the COVID, they call it pandemic, the COVID war, brought to you by fucking scumbags that's closed down society, making up fucking shit. Again, going back to the cover, that the leaders, you follow your leaders, you do what you're told, you're nothing more than a piece of shit. So 80% of American households are in a worse financial position now than they were before COVID pandemic hit. This is the Federal Reserve, all right? 80%. Going back, they're going to lower interest rates because things going down. It's going to go down. And now on to the Israel war. Israel raided Gaza Shifa Hospital. Great. Could you imagine if the Russians kept attacking hospitals, schools, and shelters in Ukraine that the Israelis are doing in Gaza? Could you imagine if the people in Gaza were Jewish and Palestinians were bombing them? Oh my God, the outrage. Again, as I mentioned, that little fucking prick who calls himself a Christian, a little fucking prick, and I call it to his face, little scumbag House Speaker. He is a House Speaker, a speaker of shit from a house full of shit, a house full of shit called Congress. Fucking shitheads. This is the motherfucker. I got to be proper. A shitiot. Yep. Politician. Full of shit idiot that calls himself a devout Christian. Oh, and is he opposed to abortion? Oh, now you're killing a baby that hasn't been born but is alive. Yeah, but here's more money to keep slaughtering the Palestinians. This little fuckface at the rally that got all the coverage from all the major media, front page, that they had in D.C. that was pro-Israel. Again, I said this and I'm going to keep saying it again. He said, a ceasefire is outrageous. Johnson called the idea outrageous, prompting a chant of no ceasefire from the crowd. Isn't that nice? The whole country's going down to crap in front of our place, in front of our face. And you know why? Because we have crap heads in charge. And by the way, I no longer support RFK Jr. I was the first. All the facts are there. The email, all the videos are there. My interviews with other people are there, going back to last December, saying that he would be the best candidate because I thought he was anti-war. But he's pro-Israel murder. And again, I am of the belief that there should be no state of Israel. Again, it was invented with the Balfour Declaration, and then the United Nations decided they should have it in 1948. Who the fuck are they to decide this and throw the people out? So I say, let's have a one-state solution. Make it equal for everybody and give the Palestinians back the land they stole them. And I did a great interview with Judge Napolitano yesterday. Please watch it. And you go to his site, Judging Freedom.
Generally speaking, what has happened to the freedom of speech?
I mean, generally what we saw is what we've been looking at is a kind of a suppression of speech coming from primarily at first the left to squelch all of the oppositional speech. And there has been, of course, in numerous cases brought forth regarding free speech on social media and the internet. And, we saw with the Twitter files and, of course, Missouri versus Biden that there has been incredible collusion between these big tech corporations and the state to utterly silence speech. And of course, I experienced the suppression of speech at NYU when I came out and critiqued social justice policies. They censored me very stringently and effectively denied my so-called academic freedom and free speech rights at the same time. So we're looking at a kind of regime that has worked to silence speech, but now we see that it's two-sided, that it depends on who is now being suppressed. And the state has an interest in suppressing anything that doesn't go along with official state narratives, whether that be speech coming from the so-called left or right. They are very acting as a uniparty where speech is concerned, effectively toggling back and forth between the right and the left to suppress the other side's speech.
Let's talk about the government attempting to do indirectly what it can't do directly with respect to speech. I mean, theoretically, the government cannot infringe upon the content of speech. It could interfere with time, place, and manner. You can't take a bullhorn and have a political demonstration at 3 o'clock in the morning in a residential neighborhood. I get it.
Right.
But when the government doesn't like the content of speech, let's say on a particular website, and it goes to the website and uses a carrot or a stick, we'll reward you if you suppress this speech. We'll punish you if you don't suppress this speech. And then it's challenged. That seems to me to be a pretty clear-cut case of the government trying to conduct an end run around the First Amendment. A federal judge in Texas enjoined the government, the United States, from even communicating with these social media platforms. The United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit upheld the injunction. The Supreme Court vacated the injunction while they hear the appeal.
Right.
In the meantime, the government can still use a carrot or a stick to get social media to interfere with speech in ways that the government would never be able to do. Put aside this de Blasio incident. It's an aberration.
Yeah.
Outrageous. It's unconstitutional. They paid you for the harm they caused you. But they're causing harm all over the country by using social media.
Yeah, they're using these government proxies in order to undertake censorship. And we saw that with Missouri versus Biden, in which you had the White House, the CDC, and the other agencies, the FBI, effectively calling and pestering and emailing social media outlets to censor COVID issues, COVID information, so-called disinformation, to censor even political speech about the 2020 election and regarding the Hunter Biden laptop. So this was, as you said, this has been, it's vacated while the Supreme Court considers this, I suppose. But there's still other types of proxies that are in operation. For example, at Stanford University, of the Internet Observatory, who is paid by the federal government to effectively intervene in social media outlets and to censor speech, to flag certain speech as misinformation or disinformation. And they do this regarding election issues, and they're calling it election misinformation. So you cannot object to anything regarding elections because you have these hall monitors paid by the state to effectively shut you down. And they're coming out of so-called private institutions, but they're being paid by the state. So this is another infringement of the First Amendment directly. It's the government taking action through these proxies to shut down speech.
How dangerous are these times for civil liberties?
We're in very perilous times because, and the consequences of suppression of speech have never been greater, in the sense that we're dealing with a regime that is imposing very dangerous narratives and extremely pernicious policies. So in the case of COVID, for example, you had the suppression of so-called mis and disinformation, but it turns out a lot of this mis and disinformation was actually true, whereas the so-called the government's supposed information turned out to be very specious. So these are cases where free speech is absolutely required for the public to have knowledge and information. And, this also goes through the internet altogether. I mean, Google, for example, has been suppressing and blacklisting and downranking all kinds of information for years. And I would suggest, since they are under contract with the federal government and they were funded originally by the CIA's In-Q-Tel, that they are a state apparatus as well, and they are serving a state function of controlling narratives and actually curating reality for many people. So you can't get the kind of information that you would otherwise because it's been banished. So this is an unbelievable series of events. I call these proxies for the state governmentalities because they do government work. They're state apparatuses that are in effect suppressing and controlling narratives and, basically arbitrating what's permissible and making even the possibility of finding certain ideas or opinions or perspectives impossible. So that's a very, very perilous condition that we're under.
Yeah, it almost seems like Israel's got a bit of a strategic problem that it's hard to separate the wishes of the government or the people there from Netanyahu's own political interests, which it's seemingly like he's got a dead political career. Now, it could be that Netanyahu realizes that and he's going out with his last aggressive bang. And even though I don't think he's so noble to go, hey, I think that this is important and sure, I'll take the rap for it. I don't think that's what he's doing. It seems like maybe same as in the U.S., sometimes when you're in a war, it's easier to stay in power. So it could be that that's partly why he's being
I think
so
that's
aggressive.
a much more plausible explanation is that, it's there. I think Netanyahu was in serious political jeopardy before this latest round of the war started. And now this gives him some cover. But if the war's over, he might be back in that political jeopardy. So now it's got to be him versus the world and him. We're taking out, we're taking out all of Hamas, which is a totally unachievable, feat short of some truly horrific shit. And so, I think that's where we are right now, or at least that's the best guess. But it is just it's just sad, particularly for Jordan Peterson, because I do think he was a very positive figure at one point, but to just be totally swallowing the Israeli propaganda, seemingly adding no thought of his own to it, as he just kind of spews these lines about how Iran is 3 months away from a bomb. It's not like he's really it's not as if he really went through okay, well, here's what's going on with their nuclear capacity, and here's why I believe they're 3 months away. It's just that's my understanding. That's what I was told by some Israelis. So I guess that's true. And meanwhile,
he still throws in and that's bad.
Yeah, right.
He's still selling it.
I mean, like, just know it is exactly what he used to accuse all these campus leftists of doing, just kind of like regurgitating the given propaganda without interacting with it in your own mind at all. And, you know, to come to the conclusion that this is, I mean, it's really amazing how war propaganda works on people. But to come to this conclusion that, like, Israel's just right about everything. There's no moral question to be raised with how many kids they get to kill in Gaza. Like, is there a number? Is there a number where if you hit that number, you go, ugh, now I'm kind of rethinking whether this thing was worth it. It's just, nope, that's it. Iran did it. They're going to get a bomb. No evidence of any of this. Just kind of puts it out there. I don't know. It's wildly irresponsible as a public figure who has millions of followers to just be like delivering this war propaganda so mindlessly. It's truly disappointing.
What happened to him? He got addicted to the benzos, and someone from the deep state finally said, hey, listen, I can fix this for you.
Dude, your guess is as good as mine. I do not know. But somehow he became friends. You know, he started working on Ben Shapiro's network. He became friends with Netanyahu. And all of a sudden, this stuff that was never really in his wheelhouse before, was never really stuff he talked about, is now, you know, this is going to be, I guess, what he pretends his area of expertise is in. So, yeah. Kind of sad. Bill Maher, on the other hand, has always been this way, has always been a total Israel supporter with no nuance at all.
Ramaswamy, why do you keep going at Nikki Haley? Why do you think this is going to be a
Chris, I don't know what you've been smoking, man. You and the rest of the mainstream media. It's laughable. Nikki Haley's been going after me the whole campaign. First debate, second debate. You know, she's been trailing me for much of the time, but I realize the establishment media has realized that there's a puppet they want to put up. I'm not playing that game. The grassroots of this country know they want a leader who isn't going to send us, our sons and daughters, to go die in foreign wars that racked up $7 trillion in debt. Dick Cheney 2.0 is taking over the GOP. The grassroots of this country know they want a leader who isn't going to send us, our sons and daughters, to go die in foreign wars that racked up $7 trillion in debt. Dick Cheney 2.0 is taking over the GOP. Problem is the Democratic establishment media is now rooting for war too. I'm the only candidate speaking for a true America First agenda on that debate stage, and I think we're going to be successful.
Vivek, how are you going to bring people together when you just put together a tapestry of conspiracies? You know that I'm not pitching anything about it. You won't even come on my show. You won't even come on my show. Hold on a second. I let you put it out there, and now, you know, I get to finish smoking, and now I get to answer, which is, oh, this is what the media is doing. It's putting up Nikki Haley against me. They know I'm the real deal. Please, she hasn't even been on my show. I'm just watching you get slapped around by her, and I'm wondering what your strategy is.
The fact of the matter is, Chris, my strategy is calling out the mainstream media like I did to Kristen Welker at the start of that debate. I asked her about the Trump-Russia collusion hoax, told her to look the audience in the eye and apologize to them. Just like I'll tell you, you're part of the mainstream media despite pretending like you're not. Look the audience in the eye and tell them for all that happened.
I'm part of the mainstream media.
Hey, listen, and you play the same games that the rest of the mainstream media does. You've been complicating your brother. You have been playing the game. You've kicked off CNN.
Of course I help my brother.
Yeah, and you know what? That's been journalistic standards that have now been failed, not just by you, but by every member of the broken political media. So yes, it is going to
everyone in the media,
and you want to
everyone in the media is responsible for covering for my brother. See what I'm saying?
90% of the media is colluding with pushing one answer on the American public for the origin of COVID-19, the Hunter Biden laptop story.
What does
people decide they want to put up as their puppets.
What does any of that have to do?
All right. So I thought that was quite an interesting exchange. Rob, you wanna open up because there's a lot to respond to there.
I have so much to say. I don't want to overstep here, but it's fantastic how antagonizing Cuomo is being. They keep trying to reframe it as if Vivek is losing in his skirmishes with Nikki Haley. The New York Post tried to pull the same move, and it might be one of the most glorious campaign things I've ever seen of someone actually just going, you are profiting off these words and speaking that directly and taking the moral high ground, which is there. It's like what you used to say with Donald Trump of that there's cards on the table and other people are just folding pocket rockets, and he's actually going, oh, I'll play these cards. It's
literally, it's because there's pocket aces here, and everyone else is like, we agreed we wouldn't play those cards. You're like, I'll play these cards. They're really good cards.
It's a brilliant tactic, and he's destroying her, and it's humorous that all these people are trying to reframe it as if he's not because they all want to pretend like the topic is so off limits. So that would be my first one. I got more, but I'll hand it back to you.
Well, the reason he's attacking her is because, as you pointed out earlier, she is the embodiment of everything that's wrong with the system. I mean, like, the fact that she can make herself and her family millions of dollars by mindlessly advocating for every single war whenever it comes up is a huge issue that is plaguing this nation. So, like, of course it makes complete sense. And he's running against her, and he's running as an America First, I want to avoid World War III candidate. So why wouldn't he be going at the person who's actively trying to push us into World War III for her own personal profit?
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
So when you say that, according to public choice, it can be useful to think of government officials and bureaucrats in a particular way, to think of them in a way as being like, maybe I'm misstating this, Tom, but like market actors in their own way, except instead of seeking profit in the form of dollars, they're seeking it in the form of votes?
Yeah, they act in their own self-interest, just like everybody else. And if you can't go too far astray if you operate by that assumption and not the assumption that they're angels they're only pursuing the public interest. And in government, there's no profit and loss statements. There are only budgets. And government bureaucrats, for example, are assumed to be budget maximizers. And every bureaucrat is an empire builder, and a budget maximizer. And another way of looking at that is that they're cost maximizers. That's why there have been hundreds of studies comparing private and government provision of the same type of service, garbage collection, schools, you name it. And surprise, the government always is, many, many times more expensive. And public choice provides a pretty straightforward explanation, in that your typical government bureaucrat, to progress in his or her career, wants to have a bigger budget, a bigger staff, more perquisites, and so forth. And that's how they progress in their career and get a bigger and better job. And they tend to be cost maximizers, whereas an entrepreneur in the private sector is the opposite, is a cost minimizer, because that's how you maximize profit. Cost minimization is the flip side of profit maximization in any business. But it's just the opposite in government. Government tries to maximize cost because they're playing with somebody else's money.
There's something called the Washington Monument Syndrome that when I learned about it, it taught me a lot about how government works, and it taught me about the need to be skeptical of various claims, particularly claims that the budget is just at rock bottom. We can't get by on this budget. The most urgent things now have to be cut. So if you could explain the Washington Monument Syndrome, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, the history of that was that in the 1960s, I believe it was 1965, the head of the National Park Service, who administers all the monuments, including the Washington Monument in D.C., wanted a bigger budget, and Congress didn't want to give him quite as big a budget as he wanted. And so he shut down the Washington Monument, the most popular tourist destination in Washington, D.C. So there were families families taking their vacation, summer vacation, from every state who complained to their Congress people about this. We came all the way to Washington, D.C. Seeing the Washington Monument was number one on our list, things to do with the kids, and they closed it down. What's wrong with you? And so Congress was taught a lesson, and they forgot all about the budget cut or the budget reduction, and gave the National Park Service the budget they wanted. And so that tactic has been known forever, seemingly, as the Washington Monument Syndrome. When I lived in Buffalo, New York for 1 year. I taught at State University of New York at Buffalo, right out of graduate school. And in the middle of the winter, they had several referenda on increasing the taxes for the public schools, and they had failed several times. The voters rejected it and voted no. And so in the middle of the winter, they said, okay, no more school buses. We can't afford school buses. And so in Buffalo, New York, it snows all day long every day, and there are no sidewalks. They just plow the snow, no sidewalks. So they basically were saying, we're gonna make your kids walk to school on the streets at 7 o'clock in the morning unless you give us what we want. And sure enough, they took another vote, and the vote passed. They'll quit garbage collection. They'll lay off police, ambulance services, all these things. I'll never admit that there's any room in the budget to be cut in any non-essential areas. They always go after the most painful things to the taxpayers, and that's the Washington Monument Syndrome.
I came across an example of this when I was writing one of my books like 10-ish years ago, and it involved the military. You'll be surprised to learn. And apparently the U.S. military had some kind of system in place, or was preparing such a system that would give them the earliest possible alert in case of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. They would know about it instantly. At the same time, they also were spending $500 million a year on military marching bands. $500 million a year on military marching bands. So then they're all upset the budget isn't high enough. So which of these things you think they were slated to cut? The thing that's going to alert them about a Soviet invasion, or the military marching bands? The military marching bands were totally safe. Safest job in the military. They're never going to get rid of you, even though you are obviously the least necessary thing.
Yeah. Now, I used to own a condo near Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. It wasn't quite as fancy as Joe Biden's a big beach house paid for by some Ukrainian oligarch, apparently. But I'll never forget, on the boardwalk at Bethany Beach, one evening, go over there, and the U.S. Air Force jazz band is performing, and everybody's having a good time. And I kind of very loudly said, why in the world does the Air Force have a jazz band? And I got all the dirty looks in the world, because, of course, this was the Washington establishment. That's where they go on vacation from D.C., Rehoboth Beach, in the summer. But yeah, that's one of the bigger boondoggles. Plenty of golf courses on military bases, too, I understand.
The Peter Schiff Show. The other news item that came out today is that the government shutdown has been averted because Biden, I think a couple hours ago, signed this stopgap spending bill that passed the House. Even under the new leadership, it still passed the House. I mean, there was some opposition there from a few Republicans libertarian-minded, fiscally responsible. There's a handful of those there. Although they didn't really do much when Trump was president, but they're trying now. But they get outnumbered. And so it went through the House, it went through the Senate, and of course Biden signed it. He's not going to not sign a bill that lets the government keep spending money. But what this does now is it postpones the hard choices, which of course will never get made, but it postpones an actual budget till next year. So the congressmen, everybody can go home and enjoy their holiday without having to worry about voting for additional spending. I would much rather have a shutdown. Everybody says, oh, we can't shut down the government. Well, I think if we shut down the government, that's better than having the economy shut down because we failed to shut down the government. The biggest problem in the economy is the government itself and all the spending. And shutting it down is part of the solution. But nobody wants to do that. And of course, if there really was a shutdown, it would actually be a little bit more popular. Because, every time we've shut the government down, it hasn't really shut down. I mean, everybody still has to pay their taxes. It's not like, when the government is shut down, they stop taking taxes out of your pay. Because if that was the case, everybody would be rooting for a shutdown and nobody would ever want the government to reopen. Problem is the government shuts down, but we still have to pay for it. Our taxes are the same whether the government is open or closed, right? That's part of the problem, right? We have to pay for the services. What the government will do during a shutdown is they'll make a big deal. They'll close the national park. And then they'll show people showing up at a national park with the little kids and they can't get in because the government is shut down. But the irony of that is whenever they shut down a national park, they have to send in government workers to keep people out because it's shut down. They always have more government workers at the national parks when they're shut down to keep people out than they have when it's open to let them in. So if they can afford to send all these people to the national parks to make sure no one gets in, then they can afford to have fewer people there to let them in and take the tickets. It's all a big show. They're trying to convince the public that, oh, this is terrible. We need to get the government back in business. But they're always in business. They never actually shut down. That is the problem. Now, some government workers don't have to show up. They love it. It's a paid holiday, right? The government workers, because they get to stay home and collect their checks. None of these government workers lose out on a nickel of their pay during the shutdown. They all get their money. Some of them might get it late, but everybody gets paid, so the taxpayer gets stuck with that. I mean, if we had a government shutdown where they said, okay, the government shut down, nobody has to pay any taxes, and we're not paying any money, that'd be better. So the problem is we don't get a real shutdown, we get a fake shutdown. But a real shutdown would be better than continuing on our present course, because our present course leads us to disaster. It leads us to a complete economic, financial crisis, a sovereign debt and currency crisis. And it would be worth averting that crisis to shut down the government. Because believe me, if we have a collapse of the dollar, the government is basically shut down. Because when the money that they print doesn't have any value, what can it do, right? What good is it? You have a printing press, you can print this money, but nobody wants it because it doesn't buy anything. Well, you've effectively shut yourself down, right? Because your checks don't have any purchasing power. So we're going to have a government shutdown one way or another. It's better to shut it down on our terms and then deal with the problems than to let the market shut it down with a dollar crisis. Now, a lot of people think that these boom and bust cycles are somehow, just inevitable. They're just part of the free market. We just have to suck it up and bear it. It's like one of the costs of capitalism, that there's inherent booms and busts. And that's not true. It's government interference in capitalism, government manipulation, particularly with interest rates, that causes this so-called business cycle. If you take government out of the equation and have sound money and have free markets, you're not really going to see these booms and busts. So it's government that is responsible, not the free market. And an analogy that my dad used, told me a long, long time ago, and I put it in my first book just to explain it. And he said, look, imagine that you would run a restaurant and then a circus comes to town. So a circus would come to town and then, all these extra people, were there. In a small town, a circus comes in and you have, all the entertainers that are there, come into town. And so now there's all these extra people. And let's say all the people in the circus, while they're in town, they start eating out at my restaurant. And now all of a sudden, my restaurant is really busy. I've got a lot more people at my restaurant than I normally have. It's crowded. Maybe people are waiting, outside for a table. And so I look at this and I misinterpret these signals. Maybe I don't even realize that the circus is in town. I just see a lot of people, at my restaurant. I'm like, wow, this is great. My restaurant's really popular. I need to expand. And so maybe I rent some extra space. Maybe there's, some space next door. And so I expand my restaurant so I can put in more tables. I hire some more waiters or, people to handle this big increase in my business. So I do all this stuff. I make these investments. I hire people. And everything is good. And then, the circus leaves. They pull up their stakes and they pack everything up and they go to the next town. Well, now what happens? It's a bust. My restaurant is empty now, right? The customers are gone. And so now I realize, I screwed up, and so what do I got to do? I got to try to get rid of the extra space that I took out. I got to lay off some workers that I never should have hired because my decisions were influenced by the circus that distorted stuff. Well, that's what happens with the Fed. The Fed artificially lowers interest rates, and that sends out false signals. Like the circus sent out false signals that there was more demand for my restaurant. No, there really wasn't more demand. It was just temporary. And so interest rates are low, and businesses start to do things based on these low interest rates. And then interest rates aren't low anymore. The Fed can't keep them down indefinitely. Eventually, they have to go up. And now, the people that you might have hired, you need to fire them. A lot of stuff has to be reversed because it's unsupported by the actual term structure of money and time preferences. The signals that a free market would have sent were short-circuited by the government.
But let's kick this off with a little strategy from Thomas Jefferson. Today in history, November 17th, 1798, the day after the resolutions that he drafted for Kentucky in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the day after they were signed, he fired off a letter to James Madison, who we know was working on similar resolutions for Virginia, and he said this: "I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain, so as to hold to that ground in the future, and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent." And yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. I think that really deserves a second take because it's so essential to Thomas Jefferson to do a 1-2 punch. That is, you have your ultimate principles, but you also recognize that you're not going to get from where you are today to where you want to be in one fell swoop. And some of the principles that he was talking about, what he's mentioning in regards to those Kentucky resolutions of 1798 include these: an act outside the Constitution is void, but it doesn't turn into void in practice on its own. And submitting to unconstitutional acts and waiting for the feds to tell us if the feds violated the Constitution is really what helps establish a system of unlimited power. So for Thomas Jefferson, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. It's not something to wait 2 or 4 or 6 years for, to try down the line or after everything else is tried and failed, but the rightful remedy whensoever, as he put it, the general government assumes undelegated powers. Now, at the same time, we have to also recognize, based on Jefferson's strategic advice, that nullifying major parts of the largest empire ever is going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of patience and a lot of steps to get there. So putting that all into practice, here are my top 4 to nullify for 2024 to get us on a real path to liberty. Number 1 is the central bank, the Federal Reserve. The Fed is the engine that powers the biggest government in history, but it's not going to end itself. Here from Hunter Hastings, an old article over at the Mises Institute. Hunter's a friend. He does great work. He said, "This institutionally independent but politically directed central bank spearheads a process that enables largely unlimited government spending. It expands credit and enables fiat money, which is produced without practical limitation." Hunter goes on. He says, "Fiat money enables government to issue debt, which, at least so far, also has been pursued without restraint." So far, it keeps getting worse. "The unlimited government debt enables unrestrained growth in government spending. So as long as they can keep this cycle going, government will never, ever, ever slow down its pace of growth. It'll just keep getting worse and worse and worse." And Hunter goes on. He says, "Thus, the state is set free from having to collect tax revenue before it can spend. And as Mises explained in such a case, there is no limitation on government at all." I'm sorry for the long quotes here, but I thought this was really interesting. Here's how Mises put it. "The government has but one source of revenue, taxes. No taxation is legal without parliamentary consent. But if the government has other sources of income, it can free itself from this control." So by using inflation, the money printer, the Federal Reserve, it's able to generate more loot for itself, even though it causes everything to cost more for us. It's what Ron Paul and many others have referred to as an inflation tax. Some of the founders called it that as well. They recognize that depreciating of paper money acts as a tax, especially on the poor. being. The number of federal gun control measures that are authorized under the Constitution is 0. That includes the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments in 1986, the bump stock ban in 2018, of course, the Undetectable Firearms Act in 1988, and everything that they've passed or basically tried to shove down our throats in recent years, and anything that may come along in the future as well. 0 is the number of federal gun control measures that are authorized under the Constitution. St. George Tucker tells us the importance of the right to keep and bear arms, the right of self-defense. And that's why it's so high on my, and this is not in any particular order. Maybe it is. Maybe it would change around next time I do it. But St. George Tucker tells us why this is so important. In view of the Constitution of the United States, he said this may be considered as the true palladium of liberty. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. Governments do not like it when the population can defend itself. That's a huge problem for them, because how can they ever completely oppress you if you can fight back? And of course, when you combine that with large permanent standing armies, which the entire founding generation absolutely despised, even if they thought smaller ones were necessary from time to time, they did not like military establishments like we have today. And Tucker continued. He said, wherever standing armies are kept up, and when the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever, prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. And if liberty has not already been annihilated today, it certainly is on the brink of destruction, despite the fact that we're still able to exercise some rights. But really, we're in a state of luck, because government claims the power to shut down whatever they want under some kind of imaginary emergency clause in the Constitution, which I guess I could cover in another episode. Now, people need to learn how to exercise their rights, and this is probably the most important part, the most important essential step to nullify federal gun control, is that people need to learn how to exercise their rights, whether the government wants them to or not, whether government gives them a permission slip or not, whether the federal courts tell them they can or not. Liberty is about being free, whether the government approves of it or not. And that's how Thomas Jefferson put it as well. He said, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate.
Empires always fail, and the prime reason, if you want to just break it down, is, we as human beings, we never see the whole picture. We can't. We only see fragments, every single one of us, and we're all, governments are made up of people. So that's why empires and countries that, world governments, they always fail, because they could never see the whole picture. Always, 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 there are things that they can't possibly anticipate that wrecks their schemes, that throws monkey wrenches in their schemes, and everything falls apart. Now, I don't know how many people, the younger generations, what they know about the Soviet Union, but that was set up to be a world government. They had the Comintern and all that, and that was their goal, to be the government of the world, the Soviet Union. Of course, it was a total economic basket case. They went bust, and after they fell, America, our country, had the golden opportunity to be the beacon of the free world, the bastion of freedom, and they blew it. Instead, the Soviets fell, and America, or our politicians said, we'll be the world government. We're going to go out and go, with all these endless wars. Now, it's not going to be communist, where the state owns everything. It's going to be corporatists, where you have the state married to the big corporations. That's what we've been living through. And like the Soviets, we too are reaching the end of our rope and heading for bankruptcy with debts that will never be paid. And now the interest is starting to creep up to $1 trillion per year, as Dr. Paul and I covered last week. Ultimately, we all know, everybody who has credit cards, once you can't service your debt, forget about paying it off. Once you can't even service it, it's game over for you. And unfortunately, our country took this turn, and it's inevitable that they're going to go the way of the Soviets and everyone else.
Sometimes we heard 10, 15 years ago, the deficit's out of control and bad things are going to happen. Bad things did happen, but sometimes the recovery and the trust was restored to the fiat money. And yet inevitably the policies that we have and the monetary system we have, we can expect that continuation. But I'm going to quickly go over a couple of these headlines that I think helps us make our point, Chris. The first one I have here, and I don't have them in the order of the significance and the importance. So the first one I have is House votes to avoid government shutdown, but no Ukraine, Israel aid. Well, no aid, that's good. But I tell you what, there's going to be aid, and it's going to happen. It'll come later. The problems are still there. And it's just that politically it was very necessary to make sure that there was no lockdown, shutdown of the government. So that has been taken care of. And another one here is on the Pentagon. We really don't audit the Pentagon. They're like the Fed. They get away with it, but they go through pretense of it. So they've done it now 6 in a row, and every one of them has failed. No surprise here. Pentagon fails 6 audits in a row. That means nobody knows. Everybody knows about the money that was wasted on all the wars, essentially, that we go to. Just think of, Afghanistan and what's going on still in Iraq and what's going on in Ukraine and all the evidence of this, because it's not well spent.
It only takes a small minority of people to prevail. Our founders were a small group of, boy, were they smart. Now not smart enough to create the perfect system, because that can't be created. But boy, what they did create was amazing and shook the entire world. Good begins with a tiny but committed group of people, just as the bad ideas do. So we live in a world where it's a battle between good and bad ideas. And we may be in the minority today, but who knows in 100 years what the world looks like. When Dr. Paul started, the group of people that believed in the ideas that he's talking about was much, much smaller than it is today. And today we have the internet, and we have we have tools that were never available before to reach so many people. So we all have a mouth, and we all have keyboards and a phone and a computer screen. We have to use it. And our small group may someday surprise the world.
Very good. I'm going to mention a couple points on the reason why I think we shouldn't give up. We should keep plugging away, but be realistic, because we know what it's been like for thousands of years and what the conditions are among human beings, that there are times that seem to continue, that there are conflicts. But there are also times when you see spurts, tremendous positive spurts of the concept of liberty. Certainly the Enlightenment, along with our revolution in this country and our Constitution, was very, very positive. So with all these problems I described, I think that we only should hone in on a couple principles that would take care of this. The one that libertarians share and many others do, because it's part of religious belief for people, that you give up the issue of aggression. You don't decide, well, if you have an argument in Congress, what you have to do is see who's the most aggressive and gets knocked out, first. You can't use aggression to reorient the whole society, people. And that's what we see all the time. Just think of the law breaking that goes on. That right now, most of it is not even being punished at all. So if people should, on principle, give up the idea of aggression. The non-aggression principle would go a long way. And if everybody followed it, there'd be a lot more peace and a lot more prosperity. Governments can't do anything more than you as an individual can do. You can't steal, you can't kill, and we shouldn't allow our governments to get away with doing it either. So I think the other major principle that makes this thing work is that the argument now is big on rights. How do you have a right? Well, the big difference for me and my understanding is we have too much collectivism, too many groups, this group, this group, this group. You're discriminating against that group, that group. I don't like that at all. Individuals have rights. And it should be that because they belong in a group, they never can get a benefit and they can't get a punishment. They can't have abuse. And right now, everything is done in groups. And it sort of annoys me on election night. How did so-and-so group vote? Well, I think individuals vote, and I understand the politics of saying putting people in group and thinking about it. But no, everything should be individual rights. There is no such thing in a free society as collective rights. And I would like to go ahead and close today by thanking all our people for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Now, the effects of Plato's view of human nature, and particularly of the nature and source of emotions, are overwhelming on subsequent Western civilization. I'll run through a few of the most blatantly obvious ones, but you could give a 5-hour lecture just on this point alone. All of the following views are Platonic in origin. To begin with, this implies a certain type of determinism, because you have no control over the content of your emotions, your likes, your dislikes, your feelings, your passions. They're independent of your thinking. They're thrust on you by your body. Consequently, you're helpless to change your character. If you happen to be born with strongly developed appetites, you are simply stuck with that kind of soul, and there's nothing you can do. And this, for Plato, becomes the basis, as we'll see in a moment, for the division of men into 3 types with innately different characters. Now, I should mention that Plato hints at certain points that in the other world, you had a choice about which soul you were going to be born with. You picked your soul, so to speak, at the last moment before you came back around the next time. But that doesn't do you much good in this world. The second consequence. Since the passions in general are bad, and since all men necessarily feel them to some extent, there is an Achilles heel in human nature, a fundamental weakness. Man has emotions. Therefore, the ground is prepared for the theory of original sin, for the theory that there's an inherent weakness, deficiency, evil built into man at birth. Now, of course, in Plato, the metaphysical basis of this is the idea that anything in this world, man or banana or triangle, is imperfect, and therefore, and semi-real and contradictory, etc. And man, therefore, is imperfect too. Later, of course, in the theological period, it was tricked up to be explained via Adam's original sin, but that simply is a mythological version of Platonism. Third, Did you ever hear anybody say, if you advocated to them the view that you should live entirely by reason, oh, well, how would that be possible? What about the emotional side of human nature? And if you ever heard that, that is Platonic. The idea being, emotions exist, they are basically antithetical to reason, and they demand some expression. And therefore, a completely rational man would have to be a man without emotions, which is impossible. Now, I remember years ago having a conversation with a Platonist, and I was taking the view that you should always act by reason. And he said to me, well, this is obviously impossible. Suppose you had a girl in the car and you were driving to the top of a mountain to look at the moon. Now, if you go by reason, what would you do? Discuss astronomy with her? Now, you see, this is automatic Platonism on his part. He just routinely assumed that to be rational means to have no feelings, always to be impersonal, etc. Reason is the anti-feeling, the anti-emotional. Not just simply the scrupulous observance of facts without using emotions as evidence, but the actual antithesis of emotion, and that therefore reason requires the destruction of the emotions, which, since it can't be done, then people can't live completely rationally. That Platonic view is everywhere. 4, there is the grading of careers, depending upon which part of the soul is most involved. Now, for instance, businessmen, industrialists, producers come out as very low types of people on this view, as against philosophers or pure scientists, pure as against, the applied type, or pure mathematicians. Notice the word pure is a Platonic legacy. They are uncorrupted. You see, by the crude physical concerns, they're off, according to this dichotomy, in their own super dimension. One of these is materialistic, appetitive, and therefore irrational. Now, of course, that's all over the place and influences every variety of intellectual. To take just a tiny example, the theory that the great American self-made capitalists are robber barons. Now, there's no evidence or documentation for such charges, but the historians who utter them and the people who accept them expect such tales to be true on philosophic grounds, because they know that they are dealing by definition with a low, depraved, irrational type of man. You see, they know that from Plato, and therefore, of course, what would you expect? And therefore, you don't have to scrutinize the evidence too carefully. You just get the Ford Foundation to finance a grant and come out with a few smears, and that's it. Now, I should mention, just for your own knowledge, that Plato himself did not include artists in the good side of this particular career dichotomy. He had several reasons which I won't take the time to go into. But later Platonists included artists as being the spiritual as against the material side, and they also were elevated into this higher category. Of course, only so long as they're not popular, because if they're popular and their works sell, they're commercial, and that plunges them back down again. What's next? 5. What about the attitude to money and wealth? What about the idea that the love of money is the root of all evil? Here is Plato's description of how the true philosopher lives his life. None of the true philosophers must possess any private property beyond the barest necessaries. You see, private property being materialistic. Next, no one is to have any dwelling or storehouse that is not open for all to enter at will. Their food, they will get in the quantities required by men of temperance and courage, and their wages fixed so that they will be just enough for the year with nothing left over. And they will have meals in common and all live together like soldiers in a camp. Gold and silver, we shall tell them, they will not need, having the divine counterparts of these metals always in their souls as a God-given possession, whose purity it is not lawful to sully by the acquisition of that mortal dross current among mankind, which has been the occasion of so many unholy deeds. They alone of all the citizens are forbidden to touch and handle silver or gold, or to come under the same roof with them, or wear them as ornaments, or drink from vessels made of them. This manner of life will be their salvation. What is Plato's view of sex? Well, I've alluded to it before, but I'll read you one brief passage. Another discussion, quote, is excessive pleasure now compatible with temperance? Answer, how can it be when it unsettles the mind no less than pain? Is it compatible with virtue in general? Certainly not. It has more to do with insolence and profligacy? Yes. And is there any pleasure you can name that is greater and keener than sexual pleasure? Answer, no, nor any that is more like frenzy. Whereas love rightfully is such a passion as beauty combined with a noble and harmonious character may inspire in a temperate and cultivated mind. It must therefore be kept from all contact with licentiousness and frenzy. And where a passion of this rightful sort exists, the lover and his beloved must have nothing to do with the pleasure in question. Answer, certainly not, Socrates. It appears then that in this commonwealth we are founding, you will have a law to the effect that a lover may seek the company of his beloved. I should interrupt to say that this is written in the discussion of homosexual love, but the principles are more broadly applicable. A lover may seek the company of his beloved, and with his consent kiss and embrace him like a son with honorable intent, but must never be suspected of any further familiarity on pain of being thought ill-bred and without any delicacy of feeling. Answer, I quite agree, unquote. Now, let me say a word here once we're on love, on what is Platonic love. Now, you might think from the passage I just wrote you that according to Plato, the thing to do is to love your beloved's soul or character, even if not his body. But that isn't true. Plato is very explicit on this. Even the soul is too tied to this world. In another dialogue of his, the Symposium, that's the famous dialogue on Platonic love, Plato gives you instruction on how true love should operate, on Platonic love. And the idea is you start with loving the body. That's the lowest kind of love, loving somebody's body. Then you proceed to love his soul, or hers. And then you go to the next step, and you come to recognize that after all, what you love in the body or the soul is its beauty, and that the same beauty is common to a great many other things. The beauty of works of art, the beauty of scientific discoveries, the beauty of political laws, and so on. And so ultimately you see that the thing that you love is beauty as such, the form of beauty, not its particular embodiments. Platonic love, therefore, technically is the love of the form of beauty. And since the form of beauty is for all practical purposes the same as the form of the good, it's the same as love of the form of the good. It is a completely otherworldly love, and as is popularly understood, the phrase Platonic love is much too earthly for Plato, the idea that you should love only the soul. You see, we have another ladder, an amatory ladder. All of Plato's philosophy is a series of ladders. In metaphysics, we have the ladder of being, from images to the half-real physical things, to the lower forms, to the good. In epistemology, we have a ladder of cognition, from imagining to belief, to thinking, to true knowledge. And now we have a ladder of love, from a particular body, to a particular soul, to a whole bunch of concrete instances of beauty wherever they may be found, to the form of beauty itself. And just as the senses awaken in us the remembrance of the forms that we had in a previous life, similarly, the perception of physical beauty, which excites sexual desire, also revives in the soul the memory of the perfect beauty that it contemplated in a former existence. And once you recollect this beauty, that inspires in you a yearning for the higher life associated with the world of forms. And therefore, sexual love and the yearning for the form of beauty really derive from one basic impulse. But the trouble is, says Plato, that most men settle for the lowest, crudest, most vulgar form of its satisfaction, namely sex, or at most personal love of other individual human beings, whereas properly their love should be for the ineffable pinnacle of the world of forms, which of course later became the view that the supreme virtue is love of God.